been a mall security guard for about 4 years when I first met a dude called Craig. Guarding was something that I fell into around 2009 when the job market went and pooped its pants. The pay was okay, I didn't mind working nights, and some of the store clerks used to work us into their 20% employee discount, which was awesome. All my coworkers were pretty laid back too, including the boss. They were just regular guys bringing home a paycheck who didn't go looking for any trouble. But then Craig got hired, and right away, we all knew that he was different. Craig was a short, balding dude with glasses who was either at the end of his 30s or the beginning of his 40s. And word had it that he'd been a security guard ever since he dropped out of high school, and that meant for a while. But you'd never have guessed it from just looking at the guy. He was shy, quiet, and didn't strike me as someone who could handle himself if things got physical. But our boss said that he'd gotten amazing reviews from his references and hadn't taken a sick day in almost 6 years straight. Now, I guess you can't train that kind of a reliability into someone, and you gotta snatch it up where you can find it. So Craig got the job, and it wasn't long before I was working shifts with him. Now, including those in the parking lot, the mall had like 20-something security cameras, meaning a lot of our job was spent sitting in front of a giant bank of screens while watching for shoplifters and car thieves. In the daytime, we were the eyes in the sky and definitely much more of a reactive force than a proactive one. Night shifts were a different story altogether, but I'll get to that later. So one day, me and Craig are sitting in front of the screens. We can access each individual camera feed from the monitor on our computers, which we use to clip and store footage should we need to. But for the most part, we don't do that unless we've got a good reason to. So when I noticed how Craig was watching this one store without a break, I got kind of curious. When I noticed that he was watching the store that sold clothes and toys for the under fives, I asked if he'd spotted something suspicious. Now, it's kind of sad, but that store was one of the biggest shoplifting spots in the whole mall. I guess the junkies figured out that formula and baby clothes sold fast over at the Hundreds block, so it became a real problem after a while. But then when I asked him, Craig switched over to the camera feed of another store and sort of said something like, "Oh, never mind. It was nothing." Now, I didn't pay it much mind at the time. I did the same thing myself from time to time, but then that same shift, about an hour before clock-out time, I caught him doing it again, and that time he just straight up denied it. Now, I said something like, "Watching the baby store again, huh?" And then he just sort of flicked over to another store again saying, "What? No." Now, I somehow got into my head that he had some crush on the girl who worked there, and in all fairness, she was cute, so it did track. I also thought that I had a little theory confirmed when I teased him with the prospect, and he turned as red as a stop sign. Now, I said, "You are into her, aren't you? You gonna ask her out? Come on, do it, dude. Don't be a wuss." He didn't get mad or anything. He just told me to stop while trying to keep a grin off his face. I left him alone, but not enough being like, turns out you're human after all. You're alright, kid." I clocked out maybe an hour or two later, and Craig grinned as I said, "Hey, don't let anyone else catch you crushing on the baby store girl again. They'll think you're stalking her." Over the next month or so, I was on a sort of string of night shifts watching the mall overnight, and 2 of those shifts were spent with Craig. I didn't see him as creepy robot anymore, just a quiet guy who focused on what was in front of him. But I did give him hell about not asking the baby store girl out yet. I told him to live a little, because the worst she could say is no. That's not even like he had to go anywhere near the store during daylight hours either, not unless it was an emergency. But still, all he did was grin and tell me to just buzz off. Now, night shifts were different to days in that we actively patrolled the mall complex once every half hour. Now, one guy would leave the office and take a walk around, while the other stayed behind to watch his back from the screen bank. We wouldn't always keep our eyes glued to the screens, not unless the walker called on the radio. So as Craig was walking around the mall from the 2:30 a.m. patrol, I wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. And not until I happened to look up and see that one of the store's shutters had been partially opened. Now right away, I radioed over to Craig saying, "Dude, one of the stores is unlocked." And then I had this weird sort of like twin moment of realization as two thoughts hit me at once. Craig wasn't answering his radio, and the store that was open was the baby clothes store. Now right away I'm thinking, uh-oh, Craig's in the baby store, mainly because we were not allowed to just walk into the stores after closing time, not unless something serious is going down. And since Craig was so reliable, I figured that there's no way that he'd be risking his job like that unless there was something wrong. So I grabbed my keys, and off I went to the baby clothes store. Now a few minutes later, I'm ducking under the half-raised shutter, yelling out, "Craig, you in here, buddy?" And immediately he responds, "Yeah, I'm here," and steps out from behind one of the displays. He almost scared the crap out of me, and then I asked what the hell he was doing, and he told me he thought he heard something from inside the store. Now I say, "Dude, why didn't you hit me up on the radio? That's why I'm here." As in, why I was sitting at the screen bank. Now he hears something, he calls it in, and I can see past the shutters and into the store with nothing but a swivel on my chair. So as soon as he said it, I knew his excuse was nonsense, and I reminded him of what he was doing might actually get his butt fired. And it was like dealing with some dumb newbie. Only Craig was not some dumb newbie. He knew the job, and he was pretty good at it, so it made exactly zero sense to me why he was acting the way he was. And so the next night, Craig kind of thanks me for, I don't know, caring about him, I guess. And he thanked me for not telling on him, and he also thanked me for getting him out of that store, which was weird because it was almost like the way an alcoholic might thank you for stopping him from drinking. And I guess that didn't ring the alarm bells that it should have, because at the time I just wanted to know what he was doing in the baby store so late. And that's when he broke eye contact and said something sort of like, I'm gonna be a father. And then right as I'm about to congratulate him, he added, "And I'm scared." I told him something along the lines of, "It's okay to be scared, but I'm sure you'll be fine." But I didn't mean it. Not because I'm the kind to offer empty platitudes, but because I didn't believe him. I'm not saying that I have a particularly advanced bullcrap detector or anything like that. I just don't care how quiet a guy is. If his wife or girlfriend is pregnant, he complains to his buddies at work about it. Even if Craig wasn't the type to complain about it, I didn't buy him not bringing it up before that moment when I confronted him about that store. And I didn't all the way confront him, as in like I didn't call him out on complaining that he was going to be a dad. I just knew that from then on, that he was hiding something, or at least he was maybe hiding something. It was just enough to affect my opinion of him until I knew what that thing was, and when I found out, it was almost like a bomb going off. Craig acted nice and normal for the rest of the time we worked together. I didn't catch him staring at stores, and I didn't catch him in any stores after hours either. He was just Craig. Quiet, weird Craig who lied about having a pregnant baby mama because the next time I asked about it, he totally responded to me saying, "Huh? Oh, yeah, she's fine," when I asked about her. Now, I thought it was weird as hell to lie about something like that, and I hoped that the real reason wasn't like sinister or anything. But that, as it turned out, was nothing but wishful thinking. And on a day when I had to do night shift with Craig, a friend of mine sent a message to the Facebook group chat we shared. Now, the first notification read something like, "Chris sent a video," and then the rest were him sending things like, "Oh my god, LMAO, check out this loser freak." And he used to send tons of stuff like that to the group chat. Weird videos or memes and all that kind of stuff. And so sometimes they were really funny, and other times they made your skin crawl. In this case, the video was most definitely of the skin-crawling variety. When I opened it, all the camera showed was what looked like a kid's room, and then out of nowhere, a grown man dressed as a baby walked into the shot and then turned towards the camera. He was wearing one of those weird baby hats, the bonnets, and some makeup, and had this almost oversized pacifier in his mouth. So at first I didn't recognize him, but he had to take the pacifier out to speak, and when he did, I suddenly realized what I was looking at. It was Craig, the adult baby now babbling about mommy and having a full die-die, and then pretending to cry, saying, "Wah, wah, wah." I remember closing the video, and then just standing there in my kitchen for a second or two, just not really knowing what to do with myself. Obviously, one of the thoughts going through my head was, that's why Craig was in the goddamn baby store. He obviously couldn't wear any of the clothes there, but knowing why he was interested in them made my skin feel like it wanted to crawl off my bones. But then my other thoughts involved stuff like, was Craig dangerous? Was he some kind of PDF file whose thing was dressing up like a baby? I had no idea, and it's not like I wanted to dedicate any brain power to it either. It made me feel uneasy and very queasy thinking about Craig all dressed up like that, but it made me even queasier thinking that I had to spend 10 hours in a shopping mall with him, completely alone. I ended up calling my buddy Chris, the one who sent the video, to ask where he'd found it and how many people he'd sent it to. He said someone from his job sent it to him and that he'd sent it to just about everyone he knew, with obvious exceptions for family. Now that meant the video was going around town, so it wasn't going to be long until Craig got recognized for being the giant man baby in it. And while a heck of a lot of people were going to laugh their butts off at him, I knew that there would be people that thought he was a predator and would want to hurt him. But was he a predator? Or was he just some harmless weirdo? Now that was the real question, so that night while we were at work, I decided to just ask him about it. It was probably one of the most awkward and creepy exchanges of my entire life, and it took me like 3 hours to work up to it too. I wasn't scared of Craig, at least I wasn't physically intimidated by him, but if I confronted him on what was no doubt a deep, dark secret, what was to stop him from freaking out and pulling a knife on me or something? Even if he didn't and just straight up denied all knowledge, spending the rest of my shift with him was going to be awkward as hell, so it was definitely a period where I thought to myself, just mind your own business and let whatever happens happen. But I couldn't, and in the end, I asked him. The second I said, "Hey Craig, I saw this video today," he turned even redder than I had asked him if he had a crush. Now, I cut myself off after the day and just watched his reaction to sort of gauge it, and I swear to God, Craig started sweating right there in front of me. I told him I figured that he knew which video I was talking about, but he didn't move and he didn't say anything. He just sat in his chair, eyes locked on the screen bank, swearing and shaking like he was coming down with some fever. I guess I didn't really know where to go from there. He'd already admitted it silently, but it was an admission all the same. And I don't think I expected him to do anything but deny it till he was blue in the face. And so once I had the admission, I went to what I considered the most important question of all, which was, "Craig, are you a weirdo for kids?" And then, and only then, did I get a reaction. His head spun around and he says, "No, it's not like that, dude. I swear to God, I'm not." It was a very strong reaction and one that had a pinch of outrage to it, and not the kind of "please believe me" that you get when someone is lying to save their skin. Now, I guess I never truly know for sure, but in the moment, his answer, it rang true and I believed him, but that still left the question of what the hell was he doing making those videos? And I guess it might sound a bit weird, but I kind of backed off on wanting to know why. I mean, I could probably take a shot in the dark and it wouldn't be too far off, but even if I knew, it wouldn't change anything. Craig was weird. Really weird, actually, but as far as I knew, he was harmless, and I actually kind of liked the guy too, so there was that. And then, because I liked him, I knew he didn't deserve what was definitely coming his way, and I told him to quite literally get the hell out of town. And Craig knew it too. He knew that once people saw that video, and knew the guy who made it was a security guard down at the mall, it wasn't just his job he'd be in danger of losing. And so even though his record was clean and I didn't personally believe that he was some kind of diddler, the best thing for him to do was leave town and start over someplace else. And once I was done giving my speech, Craig looked like he was searching for the right words, and then he burst into tears out of nowhere, and he didn't stop crying for a good couple of minutes. Now don't get me wrong, I didn't feel too bad for him. Uploading videos like that was dumb as hell, and it was only a matter of time before someone recognized him. But his dumb mistake had ruined his life, or at least it was going to ruin his life if he didn't find someplace far away to live, and fast. Well, that was the last I saw of Craig. When we clocked out, he thanked me for letting him know that his video was going viral, and then told me that I might not see him around much anymore. I told him I was sorry to hear that, but it was for the best. He needed a fresh start someplace else, and he needed to fix whatever needed fixing so he didn't feel the need to put that kind of crap online. Because it was either going to get him hurt, or, this was half the reason I felt very little sympathy for him, I felt like whatever his thing was specifically, it had the potential to turn into something dangerous. Like maybe he was telling the truth when I asked him if he wasn't some kid like her or not, but people change, right? For better and for worse. And a dude who dresses up like a baby and chooses to do so in some skimpy little diaper thing and not like a onesie, that stuff's gotta have the potential to get worse. I don't care what anyone says, and I say that as a father of 2 daughters. Craig was gone by the time everyone realized what he was posting. All our coworkers either got sent the video directly or they got told about it at work. And so Craig's reputation was just about obliterated come the end of the week. Our boss said it was good that he got the hell out of town because he'd have fired his butt if he tried to stick around. And there was a lot of hate towards Craig like that, and I get it. But all I really feel anymore when I think about him is fear. I hope he's doing okay and that he found a good woman or man or whatever and settled down, because one of the alternatives is that he didn't get himself together and he got worse. And then if he gets worse, maybe he'll do something terrible with a kid or a baby. And then it'll kind of be my fault for not taking him around the back of the mall and shooting him when I had the goddamn chance. I've worked in medical science for nearly 20 years now, mostly as a lab technician, but also as a coordinator and principal investigator. And many years ago now, I used to work in a small medical clinic in the greater London area. We mostly ran blood and urine tests, and while we had an x-ray room and a few other things too, it was 95% blood and urine week in and week out. And as you can imagine, we're exceptionally careful when handling samples. I can't imagine many of you have received calls saying, we misplaced that blood you gave us, can you come back and give us some more? And that's because we're really careful with them. And so one day, when one of our nurses came to us saying that he dropped our sample, our first thought was concern, and not for the bloody sample, but for him. Now, I don't want to use his real name because that'll give away which clinic this took place in, so I'll just call him Dave. And when Dave dropped a sample, I was worried that he might not be feeling well. When I asked him what happened, Dave said that the beaker dropped from his grip after he suddenly became lightheaded. So we sent him home for 2 days, then he came back feeling much better. Now, Dave was a great nurse, an asset to the clinic, and God knows we wanted to look after him. So a couple of weeks later, when it happened for a second time, I recommended that he just go to the doctors for a full checkup. Dizzy spells can be a sign of some pretty nasty illnesses, but following a full medical exam, he was told that there was nothing wrong with him. We were relieved, why wouldn't we be? Not to mention, Dave did admit to skipping breakfast on the day of the second spill. So once again, it passed without too much suspicion, and Dave continued to work at the clinic. But then came the day that I walked in on him doing something that I told myself was impossible, and it felt like I was hit by a train. We trusted Dave to be alone with the samples, so it wasn't in the least bit unusual for him to be left alone and uninterrupted for sometimes long periods of time. So when I walked into the containment lab, I caught him by surprise, just as he was lowering a sample beaker of urine from his mouth. I froze. He froze. Then he dropped the beaker to the floor and mumbled something like, I dropped it. But it was too late. I'd seen everything, and there was no unseeing it either. Dave begged me not to tell anyone. He swore that he'd never do it again, and even offered me money to keep quiet. But what else could I do? To say his behavior constituted gross misconduct would be putting it mildly, and we simply couldn't have anyone with such inclinations around the clinic. End of story. As you can imagine, it was quite a big deal, but all the General Medical Council was interested in was keeping it out of the papers, so when Dave just sort of disappeared, it suited everyone just fine. It was the end of our problem, but not the end of his problem, because procedure stated that we pass on what we'd learned to the police. Dave had broken laws pertaining to the mishandling of biological materials, which covers everything from blood to stool samples. It was unlikely that he'd be locked up. A first offense would get him a fine and suspended sentence at most, so we were told, but he'd never be able to work in the health service ever again. His life as he knew it was over. But to be fair, he probably should have thought about that before he decided to take a shot of piss right as I walked in. Now anyway, life moves on without Dave, and although we missed his skills and experience, we did not miss the feeling of knowing that there was someone like that working amongst us. I think it was like 6 or 7 weeks, long enough that we'd almost let the whole sorry episode slip from our minds, or at least I personally almost had anyway. And then one day, after driving home from work, a car pulled into my driveway behind me, having followed me home from the clinic to block me in. Now, I knew who it was the moment I saw the car. I'd seen that car almost every day in the clinic's car park for almost 3 years. It was Dave's car, and he had followed me home. He walked down my driveway towards me as I got out of my car, shouting at him to get away from my house before I called the police. Now, I made such a racket that my husband actually came out, and our kids watched from the front window as he walked Dave back up the driveway. He wasn't polite about it either, neither of them were, and Dave only started to back off once my husband had promised to bounce his head off the concrete. We reported him to the police, but since Dave was out on bail, there wasn't much that they could do unless they caught him in the act of actually threatening us. All they could do as it stood was warn him to stay away from me, or his attempts to do so would constitute harassment. But it didn't stop him, and things only got worse. It all culminated with Dave trying to drive me off the road one evening when I was on my way home from work. I knew I was in trouble from the second I looked in my rear view and saw his car in the road behind me. I just didn't think that he was mental enough to try and scare me in such a dangerous situation. I don't think he wanted me dead. Or maybe he did, who knows. But if I think he really wanted to murder me, he could have done it with a knife come closing time at the clinic. However, that didn't make what he did any less frightening, because his reckless driving ended up with me careening off the road and into a ditch. I wasn't hurt, not too bad anyway, but I did need to go to the hospital to get checked out just in case. It was a horrible experience, but like many dark clouds, it did have a silver lining. Dave's dangerous driving had been caught on several cameras, meaning he was swiftly arrested and kept on remand before his trial, since it was deemed that he was a threat to the public. That new dangerous driving charge meant prison was now on the cards, and although he only got 3 months for all the offenses he racked up, it was still 3 months where we could all feel safe again. He didn't bother coming back to do anything, not to my house or to the clinic. He did 3 months of a 6-month sentence, meaning any other offense would have him recalled to prison. Now, I was appalled at what a light sentence he got at first, but now I actually appreciate how smart it was. 3 months is nothing to sniff at for a first-time lag, and then the prospect of another 3 months in jail was enough to deter Dave from any further threatening interactions. And it's a bloody good thing that he didn't turn up at our house again, because I swear my husband would have done time for murder. Deep within the remote wilderness of Nahanni Park lies a history whispered about more than it is told. Over the years, explorers have vanished without explanation, entire expeditions have ended in silence, and strange discoveries have sparked legends that refuse to fade. Locals speak of an ancient presence hidden in the canyons and forests, something that watches, waits, and does not welcome the curious. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul. All links down below. Hey Joel, I'm a comedy writer, and while these days I do okay, I even got my name in the credits of a show on Hulu, that's not always been the case. In the beginning, it was a grind, and trying to transition from being a commis chef to a comedy writer was not the easiest, let's just say that. Now, for example, the first job I ever got that paid me purely for my writing sucked. I was writing skits for a small company whose goal was to create viral videos. Our boss said that he knew a guy who could turn click numbers into ad sales, and with ad sales came some pretty big money. I guess that doesn't sound too bad on the surface, but the content outline the ad guy sent us was just lame. It obviously had to be funny, but he was so scared of offending anyone that he sometimes sucked all the funny out of a skit and doomed it to fail. Now, I don't know exactly how our boss made any money, I guess by keeping the numbers of employees to just me and one other guy, but he kept it going for about a year before he called it a day and quit while he was ahead. It was probably the worst, most boring writing job I ever had, and thankfully, I went on to have a much better experience in the industry. Shout out to my current producer and editor. But ironically, it was in that super boring job that I got one of the weirdest and freakiest stories of my whole life. And that story centers around a guy named Paul. Paul was a very funny guy. He grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, not too far from me, and although his sense of humor was drier than a bucket of sand, he was easily one of the smartest, funny people I'd ever met. But he also happened to be really, really weird too. He never ever joined me and the boss man for beers after work. Even on his birthday, he just wanted to go straight home to do whatever he did there. And we had next to no idea what that was because he only ever gave monosyllabic replies to any and all questions about his personal life. And the only thing we knew for certain was that he didn't have a girlfriend or wife and that he didn't have any kids either. So what he did alone in that apartment of his was just a complete mystery. Neither me nor my boss chose to probe too much. He was a chill guy and he made our lives way easier by writing very good but very clean skits. Now, I wanted to push him to find a girl or something because it's true that a good sense of humor is a huge aphrodisiac. But like I said, I was his coworker, not his grandma, so I refrained from asking, "Have you found any nice girls, sweetheart?" But then imagine my surprise when I was working in the office one day and I heard a female voice coming from the communal room. I didn't go running to see who it was, I just kind of listened in for a second, sort of like, "Dude, does Paul have a lady friend over?" Now, I stayed put, not wanting to cramp his style and all of that, but I was still quietly thinking, way to go, Paul. At least until I crept closer to my office door and heard the lady's voice a little clearer. And she sounded old. Not really old, but way older than Paul's regular dating range. So when the voices died down and I heard Paul walking back to his office, I went over to ask who the special lady was. Alright, I did kind of tease him just a little as I was saying, "Oh, what's up, Casanova? You got a girl paying you visits at work now, huh? Well, that moves pretty fast, huh?" But instead of shooting me a little grin or even telling me to leave him alone, Paul then says, "I don't know what you're talking about." No, I thought that was just him making a joke, so I respond, "Oh, hardy har har," all sarcastically before I asked him for real who the chick was. But I quickly realized that when he denied all knowledge of any lady being present, he was very serious. As Paul stared at me with this completely unamused look on his face, I realized something was going on, and the first place my mind went to was cheating. And the only time I'd ever seen anyone straight up deny seeing a woman was when they were cheating, and didn't want me, blabbing about it in front of their girlfriend. But I knew that there could be other reasons too. I mean, maybe the woman was a relative of his or something, passing on some type of bad news, or at least something Paul didn't want me to know about. Either way, I took the hint and just responded, "Alright, my bad, dude. I must have been mistaken." Now, I thought it was strange, but like I said, Paul was an okay guy and I didn't want to make him mad by pushing him on something that he didn't want to be pushed on. But then, it happened for a second time. Paul's office was right next to mine, and although we had our own little workspaces, the boss definitely saved himself a few bucks on space because the walls were paper thin. And so when I took my headphones off, the only thing that kept my concentration really, I suddenly heard the sound of a woman's voice coming from the room next door. Now I'm thinking, damn, Paul's got that lady back in the office again. But seeing as he was weirdly sensitive about it, I pretended not to hear it. And I say pretended, but that didn't stop me from listening in out of curiosity, especially when I realized that it was that same older woman's voice that I'd heard the previous week. And unlike the first time when it sounded like Paul and her were having a friendly exchange, that second time it sounded like they were actually having a little bit of an argument. Now I could hear the woman verbally sort of pecking at him, and then Paul alternated between sounding like he was sorry and sounded like he was defending himself. It actually got pretty heated at one point, but instead of tapping on the wall and telling them to keep it down, I just kept on listening, wondering what in the hell was going on in there. Finally, after maybe 10 to 15 minutes, Paul and his lady went very quiet again, and I figured that it'd be only a matter of seconds before I heard his door open and close and then footsteps walking down the hallway and out of the office. But there was nothing, and after about a half hour of silence, I realized that she was still in the room with him. And then not long after that, my curiosity got the better of me. I thought about an excuse to go visit Paul in his office and then focused on trying not to embarrass him when I opened the door. And what I meant by that is I wanted nothing more than to be like, I knew it. I knew you had a lady in here, you dirty, rotten scoundrel. But I also knew that he'd be super pissed off if I sort of blew his cover. I kept this sort of iron-straight face when I knocked on his door, preparing myself to just sort of say, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" to his lady friend. But after I knocked and he yelled, "Enter," I walked into a room containing Paul, and only Paul. And at that point, I felt like I was losing my freaking mind. I was 110% certain that I'd just heard a woman talking in his office, and I was also certain that whoever it was hadn't left either, because like I said, these were paper-thin walls. And so when I say, "I'm pretty sure I just heard a woman in here," I refuse to take Paul's no for an answer. And then I say, "Dude, why are you lying?" And it wasn't like I was going to snitch on him to the boss, and even if I did, there was really nothing that said that we couldn't have visitors in the office. And so it made no sense why he'd try and pull the wool over my eyes like that and just lie to me. Now, Paul claimed that he wasn't lying, and I felt like banging my head against the wall or sort of talking to one would be more productive than talking to Paul, because what the hell's going on? We went back and forth like that for a while, with me trying to explain how it wasn't a bad thing that he had a lady over, or at least how he didn't need to lie to me about it. And then after a few minutes of that, Paul exploded. In the 6 or 7 months that we'd worked together, I'd never seen him so angry. He went completely red in the face, stood up from his chair, and yelled at me to get the hell out of his office. I tried to reason with him, but all he was saying was, "Now, Kurt, get the hell out." It honestly seemed like if I didn't, he was going to actually punch me, so I quit while I was ahead and walked out of his office. We didn't speak for a couple of hours, not till the end of the day, and when we did, I apologized for pushing on something he clearly didn't want pushed on. Paul didn't accept my apology, and instead just looked irritated that I'd even brought it up. But since I'd gotten it out there, I'd just sort of backed off and then told him that I'd see him the following morning. I mentioned the whole thing to my boss after work over beers, and we both agreed that Paul was acting strange. But the strangest part by far was when we realized that his lady friend had to have been hiding in the room when I knocked on the door to check on him. If I hadn't heard her leave, then where else could she be? Hell, I might even have interrupted them getting a little handsy or something, and whoever his lady friend was, she was probably just shy. But even after I left his office, I didn't hear anyone leaving, so if she did leave, it was on her tippy toes, not wanting to attract my attention. Like I said, we both agreed that something weird was going on, and that maybe Paul's girlfriend was like a heck of a lot older and that's why he was embarrassed. But we were way, way off, and given 1,000 guesses, I don't think either of us would have gotten close to what was really going on. And so the next morning, I was driving to work and my usual route took me across the bridge. But then that morning, the bridge was closed. I turned around and had to take an alternate route, which meant that I was about 15 minutes late. But when I arrived at the office, Paul had yet to show up also. Now, I told my boss I was sorry for being late, and I genuinely was, because he was an awesome guy despite how bad the job sucked. But then he says, "Looks like everyone's a little delayed this morning," and then told me about Paul. I figured that he probably took the same route I did, meaning the same bridge, so it was probably one of those who got stuck in the very same jam I escaped by turning around. Now, we both figured that he'd showed up within the hour, or maybe a little longer if the jam was as bad as I thought it was. But I think only like 10 or 15 minutes went by before my boss knocked on my office door with some news. Now, the bridge was down because somebody went nuts that morning. They stopped their car in the middle of the bridge, got out, and started yelling at the people behind him. The cops had to come along and haul the guy off, most probably to the psych ward, seeing how crazy he was acting. But now, since the guy was gone and his car had been moved, traffic was flowing again and Paul could be showing up at any minute. But he didn't. In fact, he didn't show up at all. Our boss called his cell phone a bunch of times, and we didn't worry at first when he didn't pick up, but then, as time went on, we did start to worry. He didn't show up the next day either. He wasn't answering his home phone or his cell phone, and with someone having gone nuts on the bridge only to be dragged away by the cops, we started to wonder if the two things might be connected. I guess to anyone reading this, it's pretty obvious what happened by now. But denial is a powerful thing, and we didn't fully entertain the idea until weeks later when we finally got the truth. As I said, a lot of you probably worked out that it was Paul that went crazy on that bridge that day. And while that's all terrible and very unfortunate, and I legitimately hope that he's doing much better now, that wasn't the really messed up part of it. Our boss ended up meeting a guy who will remain anonymous because he could probably still get into trouble for this, and he was one of the people that had dealt with Paul after he was taken to a hospital. Like a psychiatric hospital too, not a regular one. Obviously, he had a complete nervous breakdown there on the bridge, and after blocking traffic, I figured he was just yelling "F you" to the people behind him. But he wasn't. He was begging them to call the cops, and when they arrived, they were the first to hear something he ended up telling a lot of people over at that hospital. He needed to be taken to jail and fast, because he just murdered his own mom and then eaten her. Now, before you all freak out completely, he hadn't really eaten her. He hadn't even hurt her either, and he couldn't because she'd been dead for years by that point. But the cops didn't know that, not right away. So when he swore on all that was holy that he'd just cooked his mom's head in the oven, the cops went over to his place to see if he was telling the truth. It turns out Paul had roasted and eaten a head. It was just a pig's head that he'd gotten from someplace, and he'd left it so intact after only eating a little that the cops didn't even need to send off a sample or anything. They could see that it was a pig just with the naked eye. The cops went back and told Paul's doctors, who put it to him that the whole thing was just in his head. Paul went nuts, called the doctor a liar, and then lunged across the table at him. And after that, he was officially deemed a ward of the state and was doomed to remain in that hospital till he showed significant signs of improvement. I had a cousin who was forced into mandatory psych care, and you do not get out of that system easily. They let murderers out of prison easier than they let crazy people out of hospitals, and that includes people that haven't hurt a fly. So that's the other part of this that I find really creepy. How a guy as normal, or at least seemingly normal as Paul, managed to go so crazy that he's now an indefinite resident of some state hospital. And Paul, if you somehow ever hear this, I miss you, buddy, and I hope you're doing better. Hey Joel, my name's Les, and I'm from the northeast of the United Kingdom, and my daughter and son-in-law are big fans of your podcast. They listen in the car a lot, and you remind me a lot of an old radio program we had over here called Fear on 4, only an American version. I loved listening to that on the wireless when I was just a lad, and those were all ghost stories, and I was informed by my daughter that yours are all submissions from listeners. Well, with that in mind, here's one from my days as a hotel concierge that I've never forgotten, and one I never will forget either. It was the late 90s and just coming up to the summer holidays when the hotel I was working at lost a number of important staff. We lost our receptionist to maternity leave. Not that we weren't happy for her, but her absence was a big loss because she was phenomenal at her job. And then on top of that, we lost two of our most experienced members of the service team, one of which came at very short notice due to an undiagnosed heart condition. Now, at a big hotel chain, that wouldn't have been a problem. But as a small boutique hotel that employed only about a dozen forward-facing staff, their loss was very sorely felt. I knew we needed staff and badly, but we all trusted the management to make the right hiring choices. But when they hired a lad called Brian, they made a serious error of judgment. And from the moment I met him, I could tell that there was something not right about him. Call it a hunch or call it many years of experience, but there was something off about him from the moment we first spoke. First impressions aren't always perfect, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt for about a week, and then I saw the way he looked at some of our female guests, especially the younger ones. It's not unusual to see a baggage boy's eyes wander when a beautiful lady is staying in the hotel. We used to get some very well-off people staying with us, and rich men have beautiful wives. But when I saw the same look in Brian's eyes over a guest's 11-year-old daughter, I knew it was a very bad omen indeed. And I tried talking to the management about it because we could still get rid of Brian while he was still in his probationary period. But management said it wasn't that simple. They had the right to let him go at any time, but they still needed a solid reason, something that would look good on a report so Brian couldn't find a way to accuse us of discrimination. They had the right to let him go at any time, but they still needed a solid reason, something that would look good on reports so Brian couldn't find a way to accuse us of discrimination. They told me to keep an eye on him and that if a customer made a complaint for any reason, they'd give Brian the chop. Now, I tried to keep my eyes peeled and a reason before anything happened, but in the end, the person that needed protecting was Brian. Now, one evening in mid-October, just as the nights were starting to get dark early, Brian was on shift and with us until 11 p.m. His shift passed without incident, and then he went off to the staff room to clock out and change his shoes. He always left his dress shoes in the staff room and commuted in his trainers. His dress shoes smelled awful. And this usually involved him retiring to the staff room for no more than a few minutes before he'd reappear in the lobby and leave through the front doors. But on this occasion, he didn't reappear in the lobby. It wasn't a crime to hang around in the staff room following a shift, but after maybe 10 to 15 minutes of Brian not reappearing, I started to wonder what he was up to. A couple of more minutes went by and I started to get this feeling in the pit of my stomach that got worse and worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that Brian was up to something. I just didn't know what. So I told the night receptionist that I was going to check on him. But then no sooner had I stepped toward the hallway leading to the stairs that Brian suddenly appeared, staggering in the opposite direction, and he had blood streaming down his front. All of my contempt for the lad suddenly evaporated. He looked terrified, with his eyes having become these big white and brown circles that just screamed danger. And as I got closer, I realized that his nose had been severely broken, so much so that it looked like it had been smeared across his face almost completely flat. And he also appeared very dizzy, like he could barely stand, and as I got closer, he just began muttering, "Help me. Please help me, Les." Now, I got him into the back office behind the reception area, and then after handing him a load of blue roll to stop the bleeding, I told the night receptionist, who was definitely in a panic by this stage, to phone 999 and ask for both the police and the ambulance service. Now, I kept asking Brian what had happened because I obviously needed to establish if the rest of us, guests included, were in any danger. But the only thing Brian said that made any sense was, "Don't let him get me. Please don't let him kill me." I'm asking, who, Brian? Who attacked you? Where did it happen? But he wouldn't say. He would just groan with that big wad of blue roll clamped over his mouth, and it was a few minutes that I was absolutely terrified, convinced some hammer-wielding maniac was about to round the corner and start smashing the place to smithereens. But instead, as I walked back out into the lobby to reassure the night receptionist wasn't alone, a barefoot man in shorts and a t-shirt appeared and shouted, "Where is he?" No, I'm not daft. I knew this bloke had been the one to give Brian a pasting, and for the briefest of brief moments, I thought that there was a chance that he hadn't deserved it. Brian was a creep. There was no two ways about it, but that didn't rule out him having a very unfortunate encounter with a violent psychopath. But, and as I'm sure many of you have predicted by now, the man in the shorts was not some violent psychopath, and Brian most definitely did deserve to be battered. After he appeared, the angry dad in the shorts, it took a minute of trying to calm him down before he stopped demanding to know where Brian was and started explaining why he was looking for him. So we only had 12 rooms at the hotel because the hotel's mantra was something along the lines of low occupancy, high quality. We had 4 single rooms, 5 doubles, and then rooms 10, 11, and 12 were suites, or what we called our family rooms. These consisted of a larger adult's room, complete with television, lounge, and small dining area, and then a smaller kid's bedroom. And due to fire safety regulations, both rooms could be accessed from the first floor hallway. That's the second floor to you Yanks. Meaning we had room 12, but then room 12B, which was the kids' room. And so right before he got into bed, the angry dad decided to check in on his 2 primary school-aged daughters who were asleep in 11B. But then who does he see standing there in almost perfect dark, watching his 2 little girls as they slept? Brian. And as you can imagine, Brian had no good reason whatsoever for being in the girls' room. And once that was established, and the girl's dad realized that he wasn't there in any professional capacity, he went ballistic, as any dad would, I suppose. But what happened next was just a shambles. After talking the angry dad down from wanting to quite literally murder young Brian, he demanded we call the police. But then after reviewing the footage from the corridor security system, the police arrested the dad on suspicion of assault and GHB. Brian had done enough to be immediately sacked, but he hadn't done anything worthy of being arrested. So we had this truly bizarre situation where the aggravated party was put into handcuffs while the creep who had been planning on doing God knows what to his daughters was treated like the victim. And I suppose that's just how the law works. One party had done nothing but stand in a hotel room with some sleeping girls in it, and the other had inflicted serious bodily harm, and I do mean serious because there's no way Brian's nose was ever the same shape again. And I suppose to the cops it was an open and shut case, especially once they reviewed the footage and saw the dad kicking 7 shades of crap out of Brian. Now, I don't know what happened to him, and I hope he didn't have to do any time for it. Brian, on the other hand, I know exactly what happened to him. We got rid of him, not a moment too soon either, and it was good riddance to bad rubbish. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, and click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, and all links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, YouTube Recap is out, and if you aren't in my top 5%, I'm going to find you. My name is Cody Key, and I'm a Navajo Nation police officer working out of Northeast Arizona, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. Now, a little background of what I do for a living. Now, being a res cop is different. Most small-town cops police a county-sized area, which on average is about the size of New York City, whereas the Navajo Nation cops are responsible for 27,000 square miles of red dirt, bluffs, and forest. Now that's roughly the same size as West Virginia, meaning a single officer can be responsible for patrolling 70 square miles or more with no backup showing up for hours at a time. And then while you're patrolling, you have to be mindful of whether you're in Arizona, Utah, or New Mexico, because different statutes apply in different places. And that's just about all the power the states get in the reservation, but then when it comes to major crimes, you can expect the FBI to show up in their cool jackets and sunglasses to treat us like we're kids playing dress-up in their daddy's uniforms. Now one time, after I arrested this non-native guy for driving drunk, but then after checking with the state troopers, we found out that he was wanted for a whole bunch of other stuff. But then the process of transferring custody gets so complicated that in the end, my chief had me drive him out of the res and right to the state cops, like a freaking bounty hunter might do. That sort of layered sovereignty creates constant headaches for us, and it hurts to think that sometimes folks just straight up get away with stuff that they do on the reservation. It's not just all the red tape either, because we're chronically understaffed, so to get anything done, you gotta work longer than long hours. But that means fatigue and burnout, which is when mistakes get made, things get misfiled or misplaced, and an investigation you might have otherwise had a shot with, given the actual manpower, ends up on the cold case pile. Getting time off is nearly impossible. All the dust is hell on our gear and vehicles, and since our budgets are tied to federal grants, we tend not to get our hands on the gear that bigger departments take for granted. But for those of us that serve, it's not just a job, it's a calling. We get to protect our own people, on our own terms, and in conjunction with our ancient laws and customs too. We understand the families, the humor, and the history, and that builds trust in ways an outsider probably couldn't. We feel the impact directly because these are our communities, making that 50 grand a year in take-home pay sometimes feel like a bonus and not just a straight wage. We earn every penny of that bonus, though. Trust me when I say that, and just like every other kind of cop, we don't make it through our careers without working one or two cases that not only remain unsolved, but remain real head-scratchers even years and years later. And the story that I'm about to tell you is mine. Now one day, I get a call telling me to go perform a welfare check on a house in this little place called Wheatfields. Now the guy's name was Nakota Lopez, and it was his boss who called saying that since he hadn't shown up for 2 days in a row, he was worried about him. It took me almost an hour of driving through the heat and the dust to get there, and I had so much on my plate at the time that I remember thinking, please God, let it be a quick one. Well, I think God took issue with my request because in addition to not being a quick one, it turned out to be one of the most difficult, drawn-out, and downright disturbing cases of my career so far. There was no answer when I knocked on the door of this flat-roof bungalow surrounded by dusty scrub. There was a truck parked nearby, so I figured someone had to be home. And then when I got no answer, and since I couldn't get a look through any of the windows, I kicked the front door until the lock broke, and then pushed my way inside. But when I did, it was like walking into someone's nightmare. The first victim I noticed was sitting on the couch, eyes and mouth wide open like he was frozen in shock. His face was pale but spotless, whereas his torso and lap were soaked with blood that had no doubt come from the watermelon-sized hole in his chest. The wound was terrible, but it was the look on his face that really haunts me. The look of terror, like he couldn't understand what was killing him. Another victim lay dead near the home's back door, face down with their guts splayed out beside him. Now, it looked like he'd been crushed, like someone had dropped a heavy weight on him until he just sort of burst. While one of his arms was stretched out before him, fingers forming a kind of rigid claw from where the last thing he did was reach for the door handle, I think. And there was another victim across the room, that one missing his throat. But the fourth and final victim was the worst, because he looked like he had been shredded. There was blood everywhere, but whatever had been done to that fourth victim left spray and splatter all over the corner walls and ceiling. But what really pushed me over the edge was finding his face. A long, long way from where it should have been. That's what had me rushing outside and rushing as far from the house as I could before I emptied my stomach into the dirt. I'd seen dead bodies before, but I'd never seen anything like that before in my life, and never since either. Obviously, it was a shock to the system, but after getting my crap together, I called it in, and within a couple of hours the whole place was swarming with res cops and a couple of FBI agents. No one had seen anything like that in a long time, and I'm not just talking about the number of bodies. I'm talking about the way they'd been killed. We hadn't had a serious animal attack in coming up on 12 years by then. A couple of snake and spider bites here and there, sure, but nothing that resulted in any fatalities. From the state of the bodies, people figured a cougar or maybe a bear must have gotten inside, and they'd spooked it so bad that it just went crazy on them. Now, there were obvious teeth and claw marks on the bodies too, even tufts of fur at the scene, pulled out as someone tried to fight back. But right from the beginning, there were a number of inconsistencies. The first being, how the hell did the animal get inside, and where did it go? So when I arrived, both front and back doors were closed and locked, as were the windows, and there was no sign a blood-soaked animal had either climbed or crashed through any of them. Now, it sort of made sense that one of the victims was drunk and let whatever killed them inside, but unless said animal was capable of closing and locking the door after leaving, then something obviously wasn't adding up. But the inconsistencies didn't stop there. Aside from the whole locked doors issue, the first person to really call attention to how strange it all was the FBI forensics guy they brought in. He was this really nerdy guy named Brian, and he won't mind me saying this, by the way, but he was so obsessed with the injuries animals are capable of inflicting that it kind of verged on creepy. Seeing those dead bodies all torn up like they were, it had me running outside to puke. But Brian, he just sort of said, "Oh wow," like a vintage car guy seeing a Ferrari 250 GTO in the wild. He worked on the scene for 2 or 3 days, photographing and measuring everything while cataloging the parts that were missing. And then when he came back, he said that nothing seemed to make any sense. First off, the damage inflicted on the victims was inconsistent with that expected from an animal. If all 4 victims had been trapped in there with a freaked-out cougar, they'd be scratched up and bitten in all kinds of places. But aside from the 4th victim, who, like I said, had been almost eviscerated, the damage was as devastating as it seemed to be completely deliberate. Now, the guy on the couch had his heart torn out, and the other, his throat ripped open. The one by the door looked like he'd been pounced on while running for it, but then it seemed like whatever caught him was either huge and landed on him so heavy it burst him open, or it stomped on him, almost like a deer might. But no deer could inflict that kind of damage, at least not with just a couple of strikes. And while some other kind of animal could be trained to attack a certain part of someone's body, there were no human footprints in the area that would indicate the presence of a trainer or owner. And then while we're on the subject of footprints, the next thing that Brian had to tell us sounded even weirder. So after searching the area surrounding the house, Brian and his team figured that they'd found their culprit. They found tracks leading to and from the house that sort of appeared to have been made by some black bear, and he used the word appeared very deliberately because, in his humble opinion, it wasn't a black bear that left the tracks. Now, I'm no expert, so don't crucify me if I don't explain this right, because when Brian explained it, he might as well have been speaking Chinese. And so after he explained what was so weird about the tracks to the chief and me, and in the presence of those 2 FBI agents, all 4 of us were looking at him like, huh? So he broke it down Barney style. Basically, things that walk on all 4s leave a certain kind of foot or paw print compared to human beings, because moving around on 4 legs distributes force among the limbs differently. So generally speaking, things that walk on two legs leave deeper footprints because each step has more weight to it. Now, bears can walk on their hind legs, and for surprisingly long distances too in some cases, but they're not naturally bipedal. And yet for some reason, the distance between steps, along with the depth of the paw prints, suggested a huge black bear had walked up to the house on its hind legs, gained entry to kill everyone inside, and then seemingly walked off on its hind legs too. Now, the former isn't exactly impossible. Take it from me, weirder things have happened on the res, but the chances of the bear continuing to walk away after a full meal was very tiny. But then it hadn't eaten a full meal, not by a long shot, and that was another thing that made exactly zero sense to Brian from forensics, because from what he could tell, our bear hadn't eaten anything but one victim's heart. Brian said it was the only thing he could say for certain was missing from the scene. But only a bear that was desperately hungry would approach a human home so brazenly, and regardless of how it gained entry, there's no way in hell that it would have eaten nothing but one guy's heart before leaving. Brian was an expert on animal attacks. He'd seen literally hundreds of them, and what he saw inside and surrounding that house and wheat fields was, quote, like nothing he'd ever laid eyes on. These were his words, not mine. Now, for a while, the working theory was that in so many words, someone had used a trained black bear as a murder weapon. I mean, there was literally nothing else for us to go on. Not until the results of the DNA test came back, which would give us an idea of who was actually there at the time of the murders. Now, this was way back in the 1990s when DNA stuff was still basically brand new, so we had to wait weeks before the lab results came back. We weren't excited for them too, but when they came, they just made the case even more confusing. The tufts of fur found at the scene were identified as belonging to a black bear, so obviously they weren't sent away for testing. And among the human blood samples taken from the scene, the lab managed to identify 4 distinct sets of DNA belonging to each of the 4 victims. But among the hair samples taken, and I'm talking like random hairs picked up off the ground in some cases, a 5th variety of human DNA was found. Now, this obviously caused a lot of excitement at first because it meant they potentially had a sample of the killer's DNA. But when they tried to analyze it, the process didn't work. Again, I'm not a scientist, so don't chew my butt out in the comments telling me how wrong I am, but from what I understand, they have to make lots and lots of copies of a DNA sample in order to actually analyze it. Now, I guess it's kind of like beer. You can't judge how good a beer is on one alone. You gotta drink 8 to really appreciate the flavor. Am I right, gentlemen? But then, to make a bunch of copies, you gotta work some white man magic on it in the lab, and that's where the problem came in. Because no matter how many times the scientists used their medicine on it, they couldn't make copies of this 5th DNA sample. Now, this isn't unheard of, they said, but when it happens, scientists can usually at least say why it happens. But in the case of that mysterious sample, they couldn't figure it out, no matter how hard they tried. That was probably the most frustrating moment of the whole investigation, when we seemed to have the killer right there in front of us, but we just couldn't make him out. But it was around that time that we got word from off the reservation, saying how 3 of our 4 victims had been suspects in a serious assault that took place the year before. All 3 had been arrested in Flagstaff after a waitress had reported being carnally assaulted after her shift ended one night. I read the report myself, and what happened to that poor girl was rough. But since there wasn't enough evidence to bring it to trial, all 3 of these guys ended up walking after spending only a week or 2 in the county jail. And since all 3 were killed in this one not-so-random animal attack, suspicion fell on the family of the girl who had been assaulted, a Navajo family who just so happened to live on the reservation themselves. I made the trip over there with the chief myself, and the second the dad walked out of his house when we pulled up, we could tell that he'd heard about what happened, because he was smiling ear to ear. We asked if we could talk, and he told us to either arrest him or get off of his property, and then that was that. We got back into my truck and drove all the way back to the sheriff's office, knowing that there was a hell of a good chance that the girl's family had been involved in the murders. But how was something we were never able to figure out. Now, I'm sure I probably don't need to tell you this because we never did find anyone with a highly trained killer bear that walked everywhere on two legs, and we never managed to match the DNA sample to anyone because all the remaining samples were thrown out for fear of contaminants. We kept on working it for a while, hoping something might come up, but in the end, we were diverted to other cases and the Wheatfields murders ended up on the cold pile. The department moved on for the most part, but every so often we'd reopen the file, read through the details, and wonder what the hell happened that night. So my grandfather, Bill, lived one hell of a life. He grew up in the early 1900s in a poor family from Oklahoma City, so even at a young age, he was put to work so he could bolster the family income. So he was a pin setter at a bowling alley for a while, and then he worked as a crow scarer before a brief spell as a mudlark. Now the first is exactly what it sounds like, but the latter was when people would scour muddy riverbanks for valuables, kind of like those New York City dirt divers who go digging for treasure in the Diamond District. By the time he was a teenager, he'd already worked on the railroads as a lamplighter and a rat catcher's assistant, believe it or not. And then he worked his way from an ice cutter to an elevator operator to a cigar factory worker. And those were hard times back then, and changing times too, so a man had to change with it. But at the same time, he always needs bread in his belly and a place to lay his head, so my grandfather Bill started looking for an industry that wouldn't bottom out on him when he least expected it. He needed an industry that was never going to go away no matter how much society changed. So he turned to bounty hunting. He didn't need any kind of license or training. All he needed to do was find a bail bondsman and then talk them into hiring him. But that, as it turned out, was much easier said than done. He knew how to shoot a shotgun and a pistol all right, and he'd watched his pa bring down a whitetail or two when he was a boy, so he knew all the basics of tracking and hunting. But hunting an animal is a heck of a lot different than hunting a man, and Grandpa Bill hadn't even pointed a weapon at another person, let alone pulled the trigger. So unfortunately, hiring him wasn't exactly an attractive prospect for most outfits, and so Grandpa went west. He bought a horse and rode into Texas and then stopped at Armadillo to see if anyone would hire him. They told him to keep on going into New Mexico and that once he got to Albuquerque, he was sure to find someone desperate enough to hire him. And while those Texas bounty hunters weren't exactly polite, they weren't wrong. Grandpa Bill found no work in Tucumcari and no work in Santa Fe either, but he hadn't even been in Albuquerque for a full day before he heard about a bondsman named Broke-Nosed Jack McNally, who was hiring with no experience necessary. Grandpa asked where he could find this broke-nosed fella, but almost everyone he asked advised him against it. Broke-Nosed Jack only hired those with no experience, so he could use them as cannon fodder or in whatever harebrained misadventure he had planned. Grandpa took their advice and kept on looking for bondsmen who had both a good reputation and a willingness to hire without prior experience. But as you can imagine, that wasn't easy. Grandpa was almost 22 by the time he arrived in Albuquerque, but apparently he didn't look a day over 16. Even big-shot bondsmen he spoke to would offer him fatherly advice, like how he should bring up some experience in the army or as a deputy sheriff. That, or they'd just laugh him out of the saloon while telling him to go back to Okie. But Grandpa hadn't traveled all the way to Albuquerque to become some dog-faced doughboy, nor had he gone there for a deputy's wages or to turn around and return home a failure. But after a few days of begging and pilfering to feed himself, a storekeep caught him stealing and demanded restitution. It looked like Grandpa Bill was doomed to spend the next 4 months in the county jail, but as the store keeps going wild and yelling out for the sheriff, or a deputy, or anybody to come throw Grandpa in jail, who steps up to pay for the can of beans he stole? None other than Broke-Nosed Jack. Grandpa said he thought Jack had only paid for his meals so he'd be indebted to him, but it turns out Jack had no such intention. He had, however, heard Grandpa had been looking for bounty work and wanted to know why he hadn't come to him first. Grandpa relayed all he'd been told about Broke-Nosed Jack being a slippery son of a bitch, but Jack just laughed. He said that he'd lost a couple of hires on bounty hunts before, but so had just about everyone else. The reason people talked crap about him so much was because he had a way of getting the biggest bounties before everyone else. That, and his father had fought for the Union back when he was a boy. Grandpa Bill complained that no one would hire him without experience, and asked how the hell he was supposed to get any at all if no one will give him a shot. Broke-Nosed Jack told him that's why he hired without experience, and that people either had it or they didn't. Well, Grandpa got hired on the spot, with Jack promising that they could ride down a relatively easy bounty together, just so he could get some experience. Everything people said about Broke-Nosed Jack turned out to be bunk, as in spite of his raggedy appearance and advanced age, he treated Grandpa like he would his own son. And then after sneaking up on the camp of a drunk who had been causing trouble at one of the saloons, they took him captive without a shot being fired, and that was Grandpa's first bounty boxed off with nothing but a short night ride. Now he could have moved on, I guess, and found himself a more professional outfit run by someone younger and faster on the draw, but I guess Broke-Nosed Jack treated him so well, in the face of all rumors to the contrary, that Grandpa believed he was the only one he could trust. They rode together on a couple more breadwinners, as Jack called them. Smaller jobs that had tied them over until a bigger one came along. But then, after a few weeks of merely surviving on what little money was coming in, Jack announced that he had something big lined up. Real big. Now, it was so hot off the presses, as it were, that the Albuquerque sheriff hadn't even put up any bounty posters yet. But since he and Broke-Nose went way, way back, Jack got the tip before anyone else did. And that was how he stayed one step ahead of the other bondsmen and bounty hunters. Not through any nefarious means, but through knowing the right people. But even if word of the court-ordered bounty did reach the ears of Albuquerque's bondsmen, Broke-Nose still wouldn't have faced fierce competition, and all on account of who the bounty was. For the past few years, word had been filtering down from Colorado about a group of bandits led by a man named Slim Sosi. Slim wasn't his real name, it's just the English for that Navajo word Sosi, which in turn was a little more than an alias he used. Slim and his boys used to rob trains, trucks, and travelers. They even hit general stores or banks when they were desperate enough. Slim himself would never show up at any of the robberies. His boys did all the dirty work for him, but you always knew when it was them that had done it because of the terror and bloodshed they always left in their wake. And they didn't just kill indiscriminately, they threw their own lives away too. They'd do things like ride with a vanguard, whose sole purpose was to tie down the cops while they burned and looted. It didn't seem to matter if half of them were doomed. They rode anyway, like the only thing that was important was getting Slim Sosi his money. There were a couple of bounties over in Colorado with his name on them, but no one who went after him and his gang ever came back. The price on his head just kept on rising, and folks kept on gathering up posses and going after him. But if they did come back, they came back bleeding, and never with the same number of guys they went out with. The Sosi gang was seemingly unstoppable, at least until they tried robbing a bank said to have a vault full of cash and gold. Because when they showed up, they found nothing but an ambush waiting for them. Slim Sosi must have sent pretty much every man he had at that bank, because word is about 30 to 40 riders showed up, all wearing masks and shooting their guns in the air. But a bunch of federal agents were lying in wait atop nearby buildings, and when the Sosi boys were least expecting it, they opened up on them. It was a massacre, and since only a handful of the riders were smart enough to turn tail and run, the streets of that little Colorado town ran red with their blood. The feds chased them all the way up into the hills near the Arizona state line, but lost them among the hills, trees, and caves of what by then was the Ute Reservation. The feds kept on searching for a while, but found no one. Then come late spring of that next year, and there's a robbery in this little town called Twin Lakes in northwestern New Mexico. Only one person survived it by playing dead after he'd been shot, but he was quite certain that the man who shot him looked more like some kind of medicine man than any kind of bandit. And based on that description alone, the Albuquerque sheriff was sure, as eggs is eggs, that it was Slim Sosi they were describing. Putting a bounty on him at full strength would mean sending men to their deaths, but in a weakened state, a team of savvy bounty hunters just might be able to bring him in, dead or alive. The price on his head wasn't as big as it had been up in Colorado, but split 3 or 4 ways, it would be enough to live comfortably on for about 6 months to a year. And that was just the kind of money Grandpa Bill was looking to make. So instead of suggesting that maybe the Sosi gang was a bigger mouthful than they could chew, he helped Broke-Nosed Jack recruit a third man, and then they rode for the hills and towards certain death. First came the reconnaissance, as Grandpa Bill, Broke-Nosed Jack, and a man named Marcus Washington rode from village to village asking local Navajo where they figured that the Sosi gang might be held up. In all but one case, they suggested a hill overlooking Bull Canyon. There were caves up there, lots of them, and while one side gave them the cover of dense forest, the other side looked over the canyon and acted as a kind of lookout post for anyone approaching. Broke-Nosed Jack figured that their only chance was to sneak up on the cave using the trees as cover, but to get there, the 3 of them would have to ride a whole day before they reached a suitable spot to make camp. They had to stay as quiet and invisible as possible, so there were no fires that night, just hard ground and the fear of what awaited them the next morning. But before the sun had even risen on the first day's hunt, disaster struck. While the 3 men were trying to sleep, Grandpa Bill said he woke up to the sound of something rushing through the darkness towards them. But by the time anyone had even flicked on their flashlight, a large Mexican gray wolf pounced on Marcus Washington and began savaging him. Broke-Nosed Jack fired 2 careful shots, and although both missed, he managed to scare the wolf off, but the damage had been done. Marcus survived his injuries, but his leg had been near shredded below the knee, and so after sterilizing it as best he could with some whiskey-soaked bandages, Jack put the wounded man back on his horse and then sent it back towards civilization. Grandpa Bill figured the previous night's shots might have alerted the Sosi gang, if they were actually in the area, but no one had come down the hillside firing at them through the trees, so either they weren't there to begin with, or they were too weak to even respond to a little gunfire. In which case, Jack decided that they should press on. They didn't encounter a single other person on the way up that hill, which, from what I understand, was steep as hell in places and thick with pine trees. But not long after sunrise, that wolf attacked them for a second time. Grandpa Bill said the wolf moved too fast for him to land a shot on it, and besides, his hands were shaking too bad to shoot straight. But he watched with his own 2 eyes as Broke-Nosed Jack hit that big old wolf not once, but twice, before it ran off again. Grandpa said that he thought for sure that that thing was finished, as 2 clear shots hit through its torso were bound to finish it off eventually. But not long after, it came for them again. Grandpa said it was huge, bigger than any dog he'd ever seen, and with a head the size of a damn engine block. And then when it came running across the hillside at them again, looking mad as hell with its fur soaked in its own blood, it looked demonic. Broke-Nosed Jack and Grandpa opened up on it again, and for a second time that day, a couple of Jack's shots landed in places that should have brought that wolf down. Yet it stayed on its feet, carried on charging, and would have taken old Broke-Nose's head off had he not darted behind a tree. Grandpa said that was the only time one of his bullets hit the mark, when that huge Mexican gray skidded in the dirt, yelping wildly as it was struck by both him and Broke-Nosed Jack. The wolf limped off as fast as it could, leaving Jack and Grandpa reloading their weapons as fast as they could. They expected another mad charge from the wolf that wouldn't die, but it was never seen again. Jack and Grandpa finally made their way to the top of the hill, where a patch of flat land overlooking the canyon lay near the mouth of some shallow cave. There was a blood trail leading to it, so both men figured that they'd find the dead wolf laying inside, but instead, they found Slim Sosi lying naked on a top of bloody wolfskin, breathing his last breaths. He'd been shot full of holes, so many it was amazing he was still alive. And then as he looked up at my grandpa with wide, desperate eyes, Broke-Nosed Jack put him out of his misery. They had no idea who shot him or where they'd gone after, but it didn't matter. Slim Sosi, the most wanted man in 3 states, was there for the taking. And so Jack cut off his head to bring back to Albuquerque, and then off they went to find their horses again. On the ride back, with Slim Sosi's head in a black canvas bag bouncing on the back of Jack's horse, he and Grandpa tried to figure out what they'd just experienced. Now, it wasn't just finding Slim like that which didn't make sense. It was the behavior of that gray wolf. Wolves had been hunted to near extinction in the area by the late 20s, so whenever one did bump into a person out in the sticks, they either watched from a cautious distance or ran off terrified. To have one straight-up attack like that was almost unheard of, but to have it attack over and over without any sight or sound of any pups anywhere, it didn't make a single shred of sense. Slim could have been caught up in another firefight someplace else, and maybe his boys brought him back to this cave so he could die in peace. That all made at least some kind of sense. But the way that wolf acted was one of the most unsettling and downright frightening things either man has ever faced. They claimed the bounty, and after making sure the injured Marcus Washington got his share, they lived well off of that money for quite some time. But that was the last bounty hunt my Grandpa Bill ever went on, and he used his share of the money to move on to bigger and better things. But what he experienced up in those forests of the Navajo Nation taught him 2 valuable lessons: that some things defy any kind of rational explanation, and that others are better off forgotten. My name is Tom Yazzie, and I'm 78 years old now, so most people around here call me Grandpa Tom, and I live out near the Chuska Mountains here on the Navajo Nation. Now, my life is pretty steady these days. I get up early, drink my coffee outside if the weather's nice enough, and then keep busy by working on stuff around the house or heading over to my daughter's place to see my grandkids. Now, I live much like any other older gentleman in America, I guess, just with one big difference. I'm an elder, and as many of you may know, that means that I have an important role to play in my community. When it comes down to it, I'd say that my role is about 50% giving advice and 50% just listening to people. And it's not just spiritual stuff either. People ask me to give them home improvement advice, dating advice, all kinds of different stuff. But sometimes they just want to vent too, about their jobs, about their kids on social media, you name it. I know I go to chapter meetings when they need elders there, and I still help with ceremonies when I'm asked. It's not flashy, it's mostly just showing up and remembering how things were done before. But remembering things is important, and the way we often remember things around here is through telling stories. It's those stories that make us who we are, and at my age, I've become a kind of walking library of them. I figure that's my job now, holding on to them so they don't fade away and become forgotten. But out of all of them, there's one that I still turn over in my mind sometimes on the darker, quieter nights when the wind picks up and sleep doesn't come easy. It's not one of the big creation stories or hero tales, and while it involves plain old regular people, it's not altogether a regular story either. It's a mystery, maybe the greatest I'll ever personally know of, but let me warn you beforehand, it won't make a single lick of sense to you, because it sure as heck doesn't to me. One night, we get a call saying a girl named Nasha hadn't come home after playing in the woods with her friends. The girl was only 9 at the time, so obviously still a very vulnerable person at that age. So myself, a handful of reservation officers, and a whole bunch of volunteers spent all night wandering the woods, calling out Nasha's name. By the time dawn broke, we still hadn't found the girl, So, understandably, people were starting to get either very worried or pretty hopeless. They still searched, but some folks said that they believed Nasha was dead. And so later that morning, when little Nasha showed up at her parents' place without a stitch of clothing on her, people were overjoyed to see her with breath still in her lungs. But that joy didn't last long, because when Nasha explained what had happened to her, everyone who heard the story was horrified. Like I said, little Nasha had been playing with her friends out in the woods, not too far from her home, when she became separated for some reason. She tried to find her friends again, but soon realized that there was a man following her through the trees. Police asked her to describe what the man looked like, but Nasha couldn't. All she said was that he appeared as a sort of dark shape, moving behind her from tree to tree. Then, as he got closer and closer, she got frightened and started to run. The man chased her, and he was faster too. So in order to get away from him, Nasha squeezed herself into the hollow of some tree and crouched down so the man wouldn't be able to grab her. But after, she couldn't remember a thing. Sadly, in considering what condition she showed up in, this was most likely due to the fact that her attempts to evade the man hadn't been successful. Yet following a medical exam, we discovered the extent of her injuries was nothing short of baffling. On the surface, the abuse that poor girl had been subjected to was extreme in nature. First off, the girl's teeth were cracked, each and every one of them, and secondly, all her fingers and toenails appeared to have been removed. Now this offered a suggestion that the girl had been tortured by the man who chased her and caught her. But then, after that medical exam, we found out some strangely good news. To our relief, the doctors declared that there was no indication that Nasha had been violated in any shape or form. This was obviously welcomed by all involved, but the nature of Nasha's injuries still had us all scratching our heads wondering. For example, while the girl's teeth were cracked, there was no corresponding injuries to her face, mouth, or gums. And it was like whoever caught her had, and with exceptional care, taken a small hammer to each one of them while Nasha had been rendered unconscious. The damage to her finger and toenails didn't seem to add up either. If they'd been torn out via torture, then there'd have been damage to the surrounding tissue, but there wasn't. In fact, the doctors said it appeared as if some kind of onychomedesis had taken place, which is basically the nail bed had deliberately and harmlessly separated itself from the nail. Now, it grew back all right. It took a while, but they did. But that then raised the question of what the hell happened to this girl to make her body react in such a strange way? Now, one explanation was that she'd suffered some kind of allergic reaction, but blood tests showed no indication that that was the case, and it didn't stop there either. Doctors found extensive bruising on Nasha's limbs and torso, which supported the theory that she'd been violently beaten by whoever caught her in the woods that evening. But after her medical exam, doctors found the bruises weren't the result of blunt force trauma, but severe muscle tears which caused tiny blood vessels within the tissue to break and leak blood. But then what caused these injuries, if not severe beating? Well, when the doctors came back with an answer, we felt no closer to the truth than we were before, because they told us in no uncertain terms that it was like little Nasha had been tortured by being stretched. Kind of like what you would have found in the old-school Spanish Inquisition style, as in tied to a rack before having their arms and legs pulled in opposite directions. Now, all in all, it appeared as if Nasha's captor had subjected her to very nightmarish forms of torture. It's just that none of it made any sense. Why crack her teeth in such an elaborate way? And what had he used to make her nails fall out the way they did? It looked like her tormentor had also done something to her eyes, as in the coming days, Nasha developed some kind of infection. But following a visit to a reservation clinic, the mystery only deepened. The doctor there, after performing a couple of tests, declared that Nasha had what's called dacryocystitis, which is when a person's tear ducts become blocked and causes an infection. Now, at first we figured this was because the man who caught her had put something in Nasha's eyes, maybe to blind her so she wouldn't be able to identify him or fight back, but the doctor disagreed. Now, grown-ups can get blocked tear ducts, but usually as a result of trauma. Side effects from medication or just the natural progression of age. The tear ducts narrow as a person gets older. But none of these were relevant to Nasha, who hadn't suffered any facial or nasal trauma. It wasn't on any medications, and like I said, was only 9 years old at the time of this incident. However, what the doctor did say was that blocked tear ducts are very common among newborn babies, and to her, Nasha's eye infection was extremely similar to those suffered by newborns. It wasn't something had been sprayed in her eyes, it was like her tear ducts were brand new, and therefore susceptible to all those associated infections and diseases. Now, as you can probably tell, Nasha's condition caused a lot of concern and confusion, but the priority of the reservation cops was to find the man who'd hurt her and bring him to justice. But that issue was a bridge too far, as they say, because while Nasha eventually made a full recovery, the police were unable to track down her attacker, and as far as we know, the man still walks among us on the reservation, free to inflict another terrifying assault on an innocent young woman. And that's a scary thought, right? Just as scary then as it is now. And so out of pure desperation, I went for a walk around the area that she'd been attacked, in hopes of finding something, really anything, to help push the investigation along. I walked the area in question all morning, trying to figure out exactly where Nasha had been playing and where she'd gone after getting separated. I found the area where they'd been playing no problem because with a tracker's eye, it looked like the forest floor had been all churned up and disturbed from where they'd been playing together. I used that spot as the center of my little search, and then from there, I went walking in these big circles in hopes of finding that tree that Nasha had taken shelter in. Now, about 2 hours in, I found a set of small human tracks that appeared to have been made by someone running at full speed. But while I had no doubt that they belonged to Nasha, there were no larger tracks indicating that she'd been followed by anyone. That alone seemed strange to me, but what actually shocked me was when I found the tree that Nasha seemed to have hidden inside. Because unless I was looking at the wrong one, only something the size of a small coyote or fox would have been able to fit inside of it. Now, convinced that I'd misfollowed the directions I'd been given, and doubly convinced that I was at the wrong tree, I went looking all over for the right one. But I walked for miles and miles around the woods that morning, and I didn't find a single other tree that matched the description I'd been given. And in the end, the only thing that made sense was that Nasha had misremembered the events leading up to her attack, which, considering how patchy her memory was, didn't require a leap of faith to believe. We waited to see if the reservation cops could locate the man who'd attacked Nasha, and with a lot of hope, too, since they seemed like the only thing that'd A, bring her to justice, and B, unravel the whole mystery of what had happened to her and why. But sadly, and much to the frustration of myself and my fellow elders, our police officers were unable to track him down and arrest him, which, like I said, is something that still causes me a great deal of concern even all these years later. Now, I could end the story here, I guess. It's frightening and mysterious enough for me to pass it on, but I guess it's not altogether complete unless I mention a conversation that I had about a year after with another elder over a few cups of coffee. We were talking about the incident with Nasha, and thankfully by that stage she'd fully recovered and was back to her regular happy self again. Now, I talked about it with this sort of we dodged a bullet attitude because realistically, things could have been so much worse for that poor girl. She went through hell, all right, but she made it through alive and without the trauma of being violated, and all before she was even old enough to know what that meant. But the elder I was talking to, he didn't seem to share that same sense of relief I did. I asked him why the whole incident still unsettled him so much, wondering if it was the perp going uncaught or something deeper that was bothering him. And as it turned out, it fell very much into that something deeper column. He said it was something he'd been thinking about after I'd mentioned the hollow to him, and how it looked too small for even a girl like Nasha to climb into. He mentioned that in passing to another elder, a much older man, and when he did, the older of the two seemed terrified. He said he knew of some similar incident that occurred many years prior, one which had almost all the exact same details. Girl goes missing, shows up again with strange wounds and no memory of what happened. Everyone was just glad to have her back for a while and treated her like a victim. At least until she made her family victims too, when she set their trailer on fire in the middle of the night. Now, neighbors came out to put out the fire once they realized what was happening, and at first they thought that little girl was hopping around in a panic while screaming in terror. But she wasn't. She was dancing. And those weren't screams either. She was laughing, both maniacally and in a voice that was no longer her own. She was changing right before their eyes, and then when she saw her horrified neighbors approaching her, the girl dropped to all fours and went bounding off through the trees before vanishing from sight. Now, a few people went after the girl, but most stayed to put the fire out. And then by dawn, the fire was out, but the girl was nowhere to be found. And that's when people started to talk. Not everyone, because the subject is an extremely taboo one in our culture. So taboo that a lot of people still insist that the girl died in that fire. But those that had seen it happen and chose not to become part of the lie said the girl changed shape right before their eyes. They might not have used the Navajo word for it because just speaking it is thought to bring misfortune, but they may have used the English translation so as not to offend our ancestors, and that English version is skinwalker. I guess the literal translation would be something more like that which has the means to go on all fours. And while people talk about them more and more these days, it's still such a strange and taboo topic that we don't actually know all that much about them. They're not like vampires or werewolves with clearly defined rules on what they can and can't do. And as far as I know, sometimes each skinwalker can be different. But there's two things I know for sure, and that's how not only are skinwalkers evil by nature, but they derive their power from acts of evil, particularly those which result in pain, bloodshed, and death. And so to the elder I spoke to, what happened to little Nasha was no mystery. The thing that chased her through the woods was no man, but a thing of otherworldly evil that caught her, infected her, and most importantly, changed her. Her injuries weren't the result of a beating. They left behind a powerful and horrifying kind of metamorphosis, which turned her from a person into something else. It all made a sick kind of sense in a way. Her cracked teeth, the muscle tears, the infection that only newborn babies seem to get. But I try to draw a line between tradition and modernity, and to me, what my fellow elder was describing was a physical impossibility. I respect our traditions, I always have and I always will. They're everything to me. But at the same time, I can't bring myself to believe what certain people say about skinwalkers. I believe the fire wasn't an accident, and then maybe the girl's reaction was caused by the trauma of what she'd been through. But I don't believe that she transformed into some animal, and I don't believe little Nasha did either. And no matter how taboo some people find the idea, to me, the alternative is just far worse. I believe there's someone who gets their kicks inflicting strange and vile tortures on innocent young girls. Someone in our community, too. And that same community is so in denial about it that some choose to believe in old fairy tales rather than look at what, to me, is a clear and present danger. And it's only a matter of time before it strikes again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m., and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I miss the Hamburglar. Hey, Let's Read. I've been a fan for a long time. You're my favorite go-to sleep aid and my favorite listening while exercise guy. Two sides of an interesting coin. My husband listens sometimes too, and I recently was lamenting to him that I didn't have a scary story to send in to you, because I'd kind of love to hear you narrate something I wrote. And then my husband said, "Babe, what about the time we almost got murdered by that crazy guy when we were going to Barbara's wedding?" And I'm thinking, oh yeah, we did almost get murdered by some crazy guy, didn't we? So it turns out that I do have a story to send to you after all. And it's about the time I almost got murdered by a crazy guy. Now, spoiler, he didn't succeed in the murdering. But for some context, I'm a woman and I was in my 20s when this happened. We were driving across the country to attend my sister Barbara's wedding. And I'll be honest, I can't stand her husband-to-be, Brandon, and I was a bit grumpy about having to make a 3-day journey to the East Coast in the first place. I feel like it's okay to insult Brandon since he later cheated on Barbara and divorced her, so screw you if you're listening, Brandon. Now, we were in our 20s, so this must have been maybe 1997, I think. Back before we had smartphones and GPS in every car, on every phone, and we had to rely on those horrible, huge paper maps that always tore when you were trying to unfold them. And I'm so glad that those things aren't necessary anymore. We were driving down a pretty straight, long highway, but for some reason, hubby had decided to unfurl the map to see what was coming up, I guess. And when he told me to pull over, which seemed pretty safe since we hadn't seen a car for miles, and there was a pretty flat verge to pull onto, I was kind of puzzled. And then he pointed to the map, at really nothing to be precise. And then he pointed across the desert a little ways, and I saw what he was getting at. There was a town, or part of one anyway, and it looked a bit run down, that wasn't on our map, and we made sure to get the latest revision. Now, this would happen sometimes with certain landmarks or areas. If they were demolished or no longer relevant, then they'd just simply be taken off the map. And so the town, which was clearly some sort of ghost town, wasn't marked down on the map because presumably nobody would have any reason to go there, and so there was no point wasting the ink to print an indicator that the town used to be there, I guess. Now, naturally, this meant that hubby and I both wanted to check out this town that wasn't worth including on the map. Now, our 4x4 was pretty robust, and we were on a fairly smooth area of the desert, so we felt comfortable driving off-road a ways until we were closer to said town. Now, it wasn't too hot that day either, so we walked the remaining 20 minutes. When we got closer, it seemed more apparent that the town was a little more complete than we'd first thought. However, we were kind of nervous because there were signs up on the remaining broken-down buildings claiming that they'd been condemned by a company that I forgot the name of now by order of the state. So we explored with nervous trepidation. It was eerie, seeing this place in the middle of nowhere that looked like it had just been abandoned probably in the 1950s. Now, I could tell it was probably around then based on the dates on the signs and just what it generally looked like. Now, my husband called me over to this one building which appeared to be some sort of mining office. The door was missing, so we were able to enter, being as careful as we could with the floor. Now, he showed me a metal sign that talked about how the miners should report to the foreman if they're experiencing dizziness or nausea, and that while there was no evidence of some natural gas leak, the company, goddamn, I do wish I remembered the name, wanted to watch out for its employees. Now, I made some kind of remark about how these days they just tell the miners to take an aspirin and keep inhaling the asbestos or whatever it was, and my husband laughed at me for mentioning asbestos as natural gas, and this sent me into fits of laughter. And I guess that's what alerted the guy, or woke him up, or whatever. I just heard this sort of cry of, "They're back!" and then heard these heavy footsteps coming running from what sounded like a few buildings away. Now, hubby and I looked at each other, not sure what to do, stepped outside, my heart was pounding. Now, My husband did have an open carry permit at the time and had his gun on a visible holster on his shoulder, so we hoped that this by itself would diffuse whatever situation was about to arise. Now, coming up Main Street of this ghost town was this tall, wiry man with a big, bushy beard. Now, he was very chunky for someone who looked like he'd been living off the land for years and wore this biker's jacket that had probably been black once but was caked brown with so much dust you couldn't tell. He also wore torn jeans that weren't much cleaner, and weirdly though, I noticed that his boots were absolutely spotless, like he polished them every day. And it made me think that he was some sort of ex-military guy, and shining his boots was the one thing that had stuck in his mind. Now, the guy started yelling at us about how he knew that we were company men. Yes, men, even though, I'm a woman, and we'd finally come to try and force him out. Now, we insisted that we had no idea what he was talking about, that we weren't with the company, and we just stumbled upon the town and decided to take a quick peek at what was going on with these ruins. Now, this man comes forward, and my husband reached for his gun. Now, the guy barely even seemed to register it or care as my hubby unholstered it, although he did stop a few feet away from us, so maybe that was for protection. Who knows? Now, it was hard to tell, given the insane rant that he went on next. He started yelling about how the town had been evacuated in the 50s when he was a boy of 18 who just started working in the mines like he dreamed of all of his life. No way was he giving that up, and he refused to leave. And he found a way to get down into those mines and proudly announced that he'd continue to work down there until there was no more coal veins to tap. Now, he said that over time they evacuated the townsfolk in big trucks, and he knew that they took them into the tunnels under the town. He said that the claims of some gas leak was a total lie, and there was definitely no carbon monoxide in the air because look at him, he's fine. And somehow I didn't see this guy as the poster child for someone who doesn't have mild carbon monoxide poisoning. And then he offered to take us down into those tunnels, where he could show us the remains of the experiments that they'd done down there. He begins to rant about how they tried to fuse people with the rocks and create soldiers out of the rocks and all sorts of other insane crap involving experimenting on people with the rocks. We politely declined his offer to accompany him down into those tunnels, figuring that the only rock that we'd be encountering is the one that he'd used to bash our heads in. Now, this enraged him so instantly and suddenly that my husband didn't even have time to flick the safety off. This hobo charged him and sent the gun flying out of his hand, and then he pushed him to the ground and started choking him out. Now, my husband was a newly minted cop, and he was a bit of a gym bro, so he wasn't exactly some pushover, but this large old hobo drifter had him pinned and was choking him so bad that my husband genuinely could not pull the guy's hands from his throat. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where the gun had been knocked to, and I couldn't just tackle this dude. But then it hit me. There were rocks all over the path, and I grabbed one that looked like just the right size, not to kill him, but to send him falling back, and threw it straight at his head. Now, I expected it to hit him in the temple and knock him sideways maybe, or disorient him, but my aim was slightly off, and I winced as the rock connected with the man's jaw, causing a very loud crack and his bottom jaw to just kind of go limp. Now, I took this change to now barrel into him like some football player or something and knock him off of my husband, who had already started to loosen the guy's grip on his throat. Now, we turned around and ran for it. I've never ran so fast or so frantically in my life. My husband and I stayed hand in hand to stop each other from slipping on the desert sand as we ran back to our vehicle. Now, I guess this transient found my husband's gun because we heard the sound of it going off, which thankfully seemed to come from nowhere near us. We reached the vehicle, got in, peeled out of there, and then just drove and drove and drove until we found the next rest stop and could call the cops. Now, my husband, being a police officer himself, explained that he was now off duty, obviously, and his personal weapon had been acquired by our assailant, so if they were going to go to that ghost town, they might want to consider the suspect an armed and dangerous one. Now, we waited at the rest stop for 8 hours until an officer arrived. The nearest town was some ways away, and it had taken them a long old while to reach the abandoned town. When they got there, There was no sign of this guy despite searching all the buildings. They did manage to retrieve my husband's firearm, which they did have to take in for evidence and examine, and they also said that there was no evidence of any entrance into any of the tunnels, and explained that the town had been evacuated back in the 1950s, like the man had claimed, due to a genuine gas leak in those mines. Now, we stayed at the adjoining motel at the rest stop, which put us out of schedule, and it meant that we were almost late for Barbara's wedding, and frankly, I think missing her wedding would have caused more threatening behavior than the hobo ever could. I do wonder what became of that guy. Now, he's probably obviously dead by now, as he was an old man back in the 90s, but you never know. Maybe huffing all that carbon monoxide or being part of his imaginary rock experiments means he's still out there somewhere, ranting about being evicted by the company. Good evening, Let's Read. Well, probably afternoon for you, if it's evening for me. You see, I live in a country in Europe. I won't say exactly where because even after all these years, I could get into trouble for speaking out against my own government. The kind of trouble that costs you a pound of flesh, if you know what I mean. Our ruling has always been dictatorial, but it was worse back then. Back then is around 50 years ago when I was just out of my teenage years. Now, perhaps you've heard of Centralia, an abandoned town in Pennsylvania that's, from what I understand, is always on fire. Underground, anyways, and I assume you've heard of it. It's a very famous tale here in Europe and inspired a lot of fiction and art. Not every town is as lucky as Centralia when it comes to awareness and the treatment of its residents, though. Now, I'm sure they don't feel that way. I know that many of them felt forced out of their homes, and I sympathize deeply. And when I say lucky, I of course also don't mean that they experienced any kind of luck. What I mean is that there are some towns where terrible things happen to cause them to become abandoned, and governments such as ours will cover it up and force the residents to go and find new locations to live, with only the smallest stipend to cover the cost of relocation. And this is what happened to my town when I was 23. Now, obviously, I cannot name the town because I cannot name the country, but you'd have to dig pretty deeply to find any meaningful records or evidence of what went on anyway. I made the mistake in the past of talking about this too loudly and too frequently and came dangerously close to shooting myself in the foot, as they say. And so, for a bit of background about our town, it wasn't even a town really, it was sort of a tiny village tucked into the mountains. Now, we knew that the other side of the mountain range was riddled with mines and various mineral mining operations, but as far as we were aware, the land beneath our village was solid and no mining operations were conducted anywhere near our place of living. Now, this seemed to be true. We never saw construction vehicles or knew of any mines nearby. And then one day, a supposed construction company moved into the village to build what they called a refuge into the mountainside. They wouldn't explain to us exactly what this was or who it was a refuge for, but it involved some machinery that I'd never seen for basic construction, like a bore drill with tank-like tracks to drill into the mountainside. Now, 3 days after the company moved in, we were all awoken by what felt like an earthquake and rumbling under our feet that caused pictures to fall off of walls and plates to fall out of cabinets. Now, we had never once had an earthquake in the area, not once, and I don't even know if they really work like that halfway up on a mountain. But we were all certain that we'd felt an earthquake as we came running out of our houses. At this time, it was just past 5 a.m. The sun was starting to rise, and some of us were still in our night clothes. And I remember one of my neighbors sobbing and screaming that the rapture was coming. It was honestly insanity. We began to gather in the street when suddenly we had to clear out of the way. A bunch of the construction company's vehicles were speeding through the village and down the road. Now, I couldn't help but notice that the drill wasn't there, although even if it was, it would have moved at a much slower pace. Now, we didn't receive answers for 2 days. The earthquake had broken our ill-maintained telephone poles, and we were essentially stranded, left to pick up the pieces and clean up our houses after the quake. Now, eventually, the technicians came in to fix the telephone poles, including a much-needed upgrade, and with them came a representative from that construction company. There had been an explosion in the mines, he said, and when we questioned him on what he meant by mines, he quickly changed his story. The explosion had been in the refuge that they were constructing, and he was just used to talking about mines, so he'd made a slip of the tongue. And of course, this is when I first got suspicious. Now, this man explained that the mountainside had become unstable and our little town was in danger of possibly a landslide. He said that the government had agreed to offer us all a small stipend to relocate, and that the new housing site around the base of the mountain had enough unsold properties for all of us to move in for cheap. Now, of course, we later discovered that the materials used to build the new housing development was extremely subpar, and surprise, surprise, the housing development had been built by the same construction company who were building the refuge. Now, a few days after the construction company representative had left, promising that we'd all receive relocation packets in the mail, I decided to sneak to the construction site. Now imagine my surprise. Instead of an abandoned site and signs of some explosion, there were 2 armed guards and clear evidence that the construction work was still underway. There was no way that I was risking getting shot to death. Curiosity killed the cat, I like to say, so it was a case of having to relocate with my parents and the rest of the town. For something that wasn't our fault, and it sure ended up costing us more than the government offered. But like I said, our government isn't the one that allows you to just complain. Life went on, but I could never get our old town out of my head. I developed this theory, though, that there was no accidental explosion. It was a rigged explosion designed to cause us to leave, and that there was no refuge, whatever that meant, but they discovered veins of some kind of ore in the tunnels in our part of the mountain. But mining there would have been dangerous with a populated village, even if it had only about 50 or so people. Much easier to fake a disaster and force us to relocate. Now, I moved on and moved to a different part of the country. My parents had passed on not long after we relocated and caught in some fatal car accident caused by a drunk driver at the wheel, who, of course, had the pleasure of surviving. I had nothing keeping me in this new housing estate. No memories, no connections, and always been a loner, always kept to myself, and I'd been homeschooled and had never bothered to make friends my age. So I traveled the country for a while and then settled down far from where I grew up. But still, the old town was on my mind, and so one day I decided to track down some of the families that I'd grown up with just to check in, except I couldn't. For most of them, it was like they'd simply disappeared. I found a handful of obituaries, names that I recognized, and in one case an entire family of 4 who'd passed within a period of 2 years. I managed to get a hold of a few families, and not one of them wanted to hear from me. They didn't say so, of course. They were all far too polite for that, but you could tell that they wanted to get me off the phone as soon as possible. One person even got pretty angry at the fact that I'd managed to track them down, until I explained that they were in the phone book, and their answer is that I'll have to rectify that. Other than all feeling very hostile, the few villagers that I spoke to all had one other thing in common. They all sounded kind of sick. They all had coughs, every one of them, and they all had the same raspy quality to their voices. Now, I can't entirely explain this, but the most logical explanation to me is that whatever that fault line they opened when they created the explosion to access the mine, it unleashed some type of fumes or burned some type of material that affected almost all of the population. I made my final call in 1992, and the next day I received a knock at the door. Now, I answered to be greeted by 2 government officials who flashed some official badges at me. They wore these black suits, sunglasses, and to me were genuinely men in black. Only they weren't here to silence me about anything fun like aliens. Instead, I was warned to stop harassing the families that I'd lived alongside in the housing estate. And finally, they warned that if I knew what was good for me, I would forget that I ever grew up in a mountain town, and that I'd certainly never been in proximity to some explosion of any sort. And then one of the agents brushed his jacket aside, revealing a firearm, and I was suitably silenced at that point. Whatever happened in my town will forever remain a mystery. While there are mysteries surrounding Centralia, my tale proves that it could be a lot worse. Not that it's some competition, but to me, both truly were tragedies. The story that I want to send you happened in the early 2000s, when me and my friends were a bit more reckless and crazy than we are now. These days we prefer a quiet beer on the lawn while the kids play in the pool. Our days of exploring random abandoned towns and desert death traps are over. It's like they say, getting old sucks, but everyone's doing it. Now I can't remember which one of us had the bright idea. There was me, my name's Carl, my friend Richie, Sam, and Carson. It was probably Sam. He was always the one with crazy ideas about outdoor adventures. And I just don't want to 100% put the blame at his feet just in case. You know, all I know is that it wasn't me who suggested that we become wilderness explorers with absolutely no experience or knowledge. Now, I was all okay, so we just gonna do a bunch of reading and buy all this equipment on some meager budget and stuff, and whoever's idea it was turned to me and said, no, we're just gonna do it. Okay, I know it wasn't Carson who suggested it actually, and you'll see why later. Now, Carson's the hero of this story, and you should know that straight up. I don't think he's paid for a single beer when he's been with us for the last 23 years. He's a legend of a man and also a very quiet fella. Now anyway, the culprit, who I'm getting increasingly certain was Sam, explained that there was a ghost town in the desert, just 50 miles from the Arizona town that we all lived in. Now I said, you mean a haunted town? And I was only half joking because I didn't really know what a ghost town really was. Now Sam, oh yeah, sorry Sam, you're getting the blame and I remembered it was you. He responds, no, you dingus. A ghost town is one of those old towns, usually from maybe the Wild West, abandoned when they realized there was no gold in them thar hills, or, you know, pillaged by bandits or other folks. No, I'm not sure he said exactly that, and there was probably a lot more slurs and cursing since it was Sam, but that was the gist of it. And so we set off, the four of us completely unprepared to explore a desert town 50 miles from home. At least we brought plenty of water and had the foresight to pack warm clothes for those chilly desert nights. Our plan was to reach the ghost town by nightfall, sleep in the car, and then explore by day. Now we'd been driving for around 40 miles when we saw a group of guys with trucks who'd pitched some tents around. From the looks of things, they'd been living in the desert for a bit, and they'd set up a little bit of a commune or something. They looked like good-time lads, you know, kind of like us really. Our age, quietly laughing and just drinking beers around a campfire. Now they must have noticed that we'd slowed as we passed them, and one of them waved for us to stop. Now I was the driver, so I did and wound down the window. The guy invited us to chill with them because they hardly ever saw anyone come out this way, and certainly not fellas their age. They looked a bit hillbilly, but I mean, really, we were from southern Arizona, so were we. And we piled out of the car and perched ourselves on nearby crates and logs while our new friends kindly offered us some beers. Now we offered them some cans in exchange, but they weren't having any of it. We were their guests. They were fun, really jokey, honestly, and made us laugh a whole bunch. Now Sam especially seemed to fit in well with them, being the hick that he is, and only Carson seemed to keep to himself, just offering a polite smile and laugh occasionally. Now, while Carson was always the quiet one, he was usually a little more sociable than this, and I wondered if something was bothering him. It soon came up as to why we were driving through the desert at sunset, since we were clearly locals heading away from town. Sam, without a thought, told them that we'd heard about this ghost town nearby, and we wanted to explore when the sun came up. Now, immediately, these desert dwellers started putting on some fake 80s gas station attendant voices, like, y'all don't want to go down there. That place is cursed. You kids stay away from that town, you hear? There's nothing to be found but death. And the best one, the guy who told a story about how the town was abandoned because it had fallen victim to a skindigo, which is sort of like a Wendigo meets a skinwalker apparently, and only happens when the dog man has sex with a Jersey Devil. Now, it's a pretty epic story, and it caused them to break character and descend into fits of laughter. They did tell us, however, that the town was better explored at night if we had some pretty powerful flashlights and equipment. In the daytime, all we'd see is rotting bits of wood and remnants of a long abandoned town, but if you go there at night, you'll see fireflies and feel this whole atmosphere that gives the place a completely different angle. And now that I think about it, they were really insistent that we explore at night, and maybe that should have been a red flag. The group suddenly announced that since the sun had set and it was starting to get cold, they'd be going to their tents, so they wished us luck in our explorations. They said to say hello if we ever came out this way again and encountered them. And so we got back in my vehicle, this fairly new SUV that I was very proud of at the time, and headed the final 10 miles in to the ghost town. Sam was riding shotgun, which meant that I didn't get a chance to talk to Carson, who'd been up front with me for most of the ride. Sam insisted on blasting 80s rock through my stereo system, so no conversation of any kind was really possible. Finally, we could see the rotting logs that made up the remains of the entrance to the ghost town. We stopped the vehicle about 20 feet away and just straight up began walking towards the town. Carson stopped us. He told us that he actually had a bit of experience with wilderness survival, and having been quite a big player in the Scouts in his youth, he didn't make it sound that gay, he asked us if we'd let him go first. Now, I took the opportunity to ask what was wrong, and he said that he'd been getting odd vibes from those guys back at that tent. Now, I was surprised. They seemed fine, and then he explained that their trucks had only recently been parked there. They had fairly deep tire tracks that he noticed, and he also said that he'd spotted a number of shotguns and rifles just lying around inside their tents and in the truck beds. I hadn't seen any of this, and to this day this is why Carson is our goddamn hero. And so he approached first and we followed behind him. His flashlight was mostly sweeping the sandy floor for some reason, and every time we tried to ask him anything he just sort of shush us. Now, he seemed to study the two poles serving as the town's entrance for quite a while, especially shining his flashlight in between them. When he was satisfied, he took a few steps inside and then stopped. He pointed to two small poles stretched further across the entrance, and then told us to look at this. He shone his flashlight between them, and then, there, glinting in the light, was very clear metal wire. It didn't look like the garrote wire or piano wire or anything that would slice your head or feet off, but it certainly was some kind of tripwire designed to do something. "We're leaving. Now," Carson said, and none of us disagreed with him. And then as we turned to exit through the entrance poles, all at once, I felt something bite into my ankle. Now at first, I thought it was a damn snake had gotten to me, but then the pain grew worse and spread across my whole ankle and I started screaming in pain. Carson shone the flashlight down and I'd stepped on a goddamn animal trap. It looked like something designed to trap a coyote or a fox, so nothing as lethal or life-ruining as a bear trap, but it still hurt like a bitch mother effer, and I reached down to try and pry it off of my ankle, but Carson instantly stopped me and said that that would probably increase the blood loss, and we had a fairly long drive to the nearest medical service even if we put the pedal to the metal. It also meant that I couldn't be the one to drive my precious SUV, which was hell unto itself. And for some reason, in the haze of all my pain that I felt, I let Sam take the wheel. Carson couldn't drive, and Richie said that he wanted to sit in the back with me because he apparently had some first aid techniques that would help me out. Now, this turned out to be that he had a bunch of oxy with him, which most definitely wasn't his prescription, and he kept promising me that he wasn't some addict or anything, but at that moment, I didn't care. He slipped me a tablet, and slowly the pain from my trap-snapped ankle started to ease. I asked him if I could have another, and after some soul-searching, he gave me half. Now, meanwhile, Sam was proving to be a pretty competent nighttime desert driver, and Carson was plotting the best route to the nearest walk-in clinic or hospital once we got back to town. Then up ahead, Sam yelled that he saw those guys from before and maybe they could help us. Except immediately, Carson told him to floor it. The guys, who'd clearly seen us coming, were scrambling out of their tents into one of the beat-up trucks, and all of them seemed to be packing old-ass, ill-maintained shotguns and rifles. But even a crappy rifle can put a bullet in you. Sam, to his credit, absolutely gunned it like he was set to win the Dakar rally. And I mean, damn, with those skills, I'm convinced that maybe he could have been a rally driver, just not in my SUV. Now, we were a pretty big distance from the desert hillbilly camp when the first shot rang out. I had no idea where it went because you'd have to have been an award-winning sniper to hit a moving target at that distance. And then they left off a few more shots, and again, nothing came close to hitting us, thankfully. And finally, they released some volley of shots that seemed to be fired into the air, maybe in anger or intimidation, and I think they knew that they'd lost us. My heart was pounding, I was sweating, and thanks to Sam and mostly to Carson, we made our way back to our town, and I was able to receive medical treatment. We'd done the right thing by not removing the trap, and I was kind of still high on the oxy, so I was a little paranoid that they'd start asking about that. They didn't, and later Richie told me that nobody would have begrudged me for indulging in a little illegal perk when I had a coyote trap around my foot. While I was in the hospital, accompanied by Richie, Carson and Sam went to the local police station, who knew us from some of our infamous high school antics but kind of liked us all the same, and they explained the situation, and the cops told them that they thought that they knew who these boys were. A group of brothers, a cousin, and a friend from a nearby trailer park who all had warrants out for their arrests. Now, nothing serious, but they did have a history of putting traps around their trailer park and befriending tourists only to rob them. Now, this would be the first time that they targeted locals, though. The cops told Carson and Sam that we might all be called in for trial and further statements, and I had to give a statement from my hospital bed where I spent 5 excruciatingly boring days. Now, thankfully, we never had to go to court because I guess whatever went down when the cops confronted them far exceeded whatever happened with us. And my guess is something escalated, prison time, and there was a story in the local paper about something similar, but for some reason there were no details of the assailants or any identifying information. Now, we all still live in that Arizona town. We've all made our lives and careers here, and anyone who says that you can't make it if you stay in your hometown is lying. We all do well for ourselves, and we're all still friends to this day. Like I said, Carson's never had to pay for another drink with us again, and Sam gets a few freebies too, because there's always that nagging feeling that maybe he was the one who suggested it in the first place, so he doesn't push back when it's his round. Either way, that was our one and only attempt at dipping our toes into what you might call Urbex. Well, Desert X, I guess. Gaming arcades, bowling, and snowboarding for us going forward, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Yo, Joel, good to finally write in and meet you, kinda. So basically, when I was growing up and in my first year of college, I got dared by my buddies to spend the night in the local haunted cemetery. Woo, spooky. The town I grew up in had a great college, and so I got in there and was able to live at home, too. It was a bonus. Growing up, we'd always known that the cemetery attached to St. Augustine's of Christ was haunted. It just had this aura at night, you know? Obviously, all cemeteries are spooky at night, but this one was different. We tried partying there when we were maybe 15 and my brother bought us alcohol. Now, out of 7 of us, boys and girls, not one of us got even a buzz out of the beers, and it was like there was this pressure in the air that kind of, I don't really know how to describe it. Have you ever been to a place that just feels bad? You can't explain it, it just does. It has a sort of aura of darkness. Now, I guess I should explain a little about St. Augustine's of Christ, the cemetery, and where exactly it is. It wasn't in our town. It was in a nearby ghost town that had been abandoned in the mid-1800s when the population grew so small thanks to a contaminated well that the remaining townsfolk moved to a bigger town with better job prospects, better community, and obviously better water. And I think after the sickness died off, there were around 5 families left in the town and 2 young widows. You can't blame them for not staying. And now one of the widows worked in the government in some kind of high-up position, and through whatever chicanery, apparently involving the Pinkertons, she managed to set up a deal via her government contacts where the land was sold to a company who were now planning to develop on it. Now, we never did find out what they were planning to develop because the owner disappeared shortly after with the contents of the entire bank account of said institution and probably spent like the last years living it up on a beach somewhere. And so that business folded, but technically they weren't bankrupt or liquidated. I don't know, I'm not some business major, I don't understand all that shiz, but the point is, this town ended up being owned by essentially nobody. Nobody could move in, nobody could develop there, and nobody could do anything except allow it to just fall into ruin. It was maybe a 90-minute drive from our town, but there was really no reason to visit. It was just a bunch of sad, boarded-up houses that reminded us of everything we lost in the early years of medicinal treatment and how everything dies eventually. It's a nice feeling. Now, of course, it would have been a fantastic place for the local kids to go out and party, but none of us want to. And this went back generations, and is still the case to this day as far as I know. The town itself was a little unsafe because there were potential predators in the area. The animal kind, I guess maybe the human kind too. And the cemetery was safer because you could lock up the gates still and have yourself a kegger, but as I said, the one time we tried, it never felt right. The cemetery was kind of on a small hill with the abandoned church at the peak, and none of us even entertained the idea of breaking in or vandalizing the cemetery or the town. It was like, F it. I sound like a moron for saying this, but it was like it was under some kind of protection, and I do not mean from God. It felt cursed. So obviously, when I was new to college and the girl I had a major crush on dared me to spend the night in St. Augustine of Christ Cemetery, I agreed. And she also hinted that she'd be very impressed with me if I did it like I was some kind of hero or something, and that was really enough for me. I mean, it had been 3 years since the ill-fated kegger among the tombstones. I'm sure I'd hyped it up in my mind so it felt worse than it was. I could do this. I could drive there, camp there overnight, maybe grab a couple of sleeping pills from my dealers so I didn't even have to worry about staying up, and then I'd use this disposable camera that I brought to prove that I'd stay there by taking photos of my watch, the sunset, the nighttime, and various bits of proof. I did suggest that someone accompany me, ideally the girl who dared me, to prove that I was on the level, but nobody wanted to do it. And so I sucked it up, and during my little spring break, I drove to the ghost town. I tried not to look at the houses slowly rotting away as I walked to the gates of the cemetery. Now thankfully they were still able to be opened and able to be sealed shut by a metal sliding lock, so no predators would be getting in. Apparently there had been mountain lion sightings about 100 miles away or so, and while that sounded like nothing, I didn't want to risk anything. Plus coyotes have been seen in the area, and okay, I didn't want anyone coming into the cemetery without me being alerted. And that's when I realized the problem with the sleeping pill idea. I brought a couple of super strength Ambien from my dealer, and as someone who'd never taken Ambien before, I was pretty sure that was just one that would knock me out for the whole night, even if a serial killer broke in and ripped me to shreds. So I left them at home, hidden in the secret compartment of my drawer that I found out years later Mom had always known about. And so I had around 14 hours to kill. The sun hadn't even set yet, and I was getting bored. And I tried to do some reading for school, and that got boring. And then I tried to read a few comics, and even they couldn't keep my attention. I just had this creeping dread around my heart all the time. I snapped awake. I had somehow drifted off to sleep outside the tent on the hard dirt floor, and by now the sun had already set. There was a light breeze coming from the east, and these voices were carried on the breeze. There seemed like there were 2 female voices, and they were speaking in what I can only describe as like 1800s vernacular. Vague hints about witchcraft and sacrifice and burning people alive. And of course, this made me feel extremely safe, and I was glad that I had my Bowie knife with me at the very least. Then from the other side of the town, more distant sounding than the witchcraft talk, but fighting against the wind, I could hear what sounded like a fire and brimstone preacher. It was the most surreal experience. A preacher with a deep, booming voice quoting Bible passages in the far distance on one side of me, and then 2 admittedly seductive-sounding women talking like witches on the other. I decided that since I was in some churchyard, the preacher would already be here if this was his stomping grounds, and the witches wouldn't come close. Or it was my friends just trying to freak me out. Now that was the most obvious, most likely, and almost certainly the true answer. I tucked into my tent and hid. Nothing happened for about an hour or so, and then I heard the rusty creaking of the cemetery gate being opened. I didn't think. I literally just noped out of the tent, swinging my knife around, hoping that I could out-crazy whoever was out there. Now I was met by two girls, wearing goth makeup, around my age, who screamed the place down when they saw me. They turned to run when I desperately began calling out that I thought that they were witches, and that I dared to spend the night there, etc., etc. Now one of them turned around and asked if my name was X. Now I'm not going to dox myself here, I'm just using that as a placeholder, and I said that yeah, it was, and that's when I recognized the girls. They actually went to my college, they were freshmen too, and they just didn't normally dress like that. They were kind of normal-looking art students, so I hadn't recognized them in the moment. No, I won't bore you with a lengthy explanation on how we smoothed everything out, but it turns out that they'd come to this ghost town to do a photo shoot for their final project, which was, quote, shameful history, and they told me that the story about the town wasn't quite what we'd heard. In the initial days of the well turning bad, 2 women had been punished for witchcraft by throwing them down the already deceased well, with claims that they'd cursed the town with some sickness. I'm sure that the 2 corpses down there really helped, right? Now, this is what they were photographing, posing as the 2 women and creating some superimposed imagery showing them looking up from the well, trapped down there. And it all sounded really cool and really interesting and thankfully not cursed. Now, I jokingly asked if they wanted to camp with me to help me win the bet, and I genuinely think that they might have said yes if it wasn't for the bad vibes in the place. Now, there was a moment when they hesitated and I thought that I'd hit a home run, but then they said they had to get back and invited me to at least walk them to their car, which was parked around the side of the town. I began to accompany them when we heard the booming footsteps, and then that booming voice rang out and he sounded very close, like he was just around the corner behind us. Now I can't 100% remember exactly which Bible passages he was quoting, but I've included a few that I'm certain I heard him growl after us. A man or a woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them, their blood will be on their own heads. And then a pause as we started to walk quicker, not wanting to run in case it caused the man, who so far was just stomping along, to speed up. Next he said, "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." And we started to jog now, and I glanced backwards. This huge man in a long, dusty leather coat was slowly striding towards us. He was barely a silhouette in the darkness, but I could see the white glow of some sort of collar at his throat. Now, when he saw me looking at him, he boomed this: "Submit yourself then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And finally, as we all broke into a run, the preacher did not seem to speed up at all, and yet he was still getting closer. Now, I remember this quote for definite because it was the last thing he said to us, and it bounced around in my head over the years. "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the adulterers and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." We reached the girls' car. One of them got behind the wheel and the other dived into the back seat with me, and we just hightailed it out of there. And if the preacher was shouting anything else, I couldn't hear it. But I did look back through the rear window and saw him holding up some old-school crucifix in one hand, or at least shining, sort of, and a Bible in the other, I think. And as we were nearly home, the girls asked if I'd like to come back to their shared apartment to chill out and debrief and maybe even smoke something to calm us down. I said that no, if it was okay, I'd rather just be given a ride home because I was so freaked out that I really wouldn't make for good company in this moment. Now, it was only later that I realized that I just rejected two hot goth chicks inviting me back to their apartment, but I was always absolutely useless with women, and this was the part my now girlfriend was teasing me about. Now, these days, I am kind of a religious man. I don't camp overnight in cemeteries, and I kind of feel like the preacher was giving me a bit of a warning. I don't know what that warning was, but I know that if he'd caught up with any of us, it would not have been good. I left that town and that state now, but occasionally a buddy tells me a rumor about the ghost town. A crucified body found in the churchyard, but of course I can never find anything about it, like he said, and a group of teens who were scared off by a guy who looked like the Undertaker. Now that one I can believe. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I do know that I go to church every Sunday and pray to God every night, and I think I genuinely believe, and it's not just fear. So whatever that preacher did, or might have done, I think he set my life on the track that I'm happy with, so you might have been out to kill me, but you didn't, and for that, all is forgiven. This event played out in 2001, a few months before everything changed. I lived in Cali and I'd recently gotten heavily into analog photography, and digital was almost unheard of back then and certainly not very good at the time. I've been taking photos of things all around the California desert, really focusing on outdoor sunset shots and things like that. Then I'd heard about this old ghost town around 5 hours away. If I took a thermos of coffee and started early, I could make it there and back with plenty of time to spend photographing the old ruins. And I saw some photos in a book in the library, and there didn't seem to be any real modern pictures of the place. It had likely rotten to almost nothing now, but that in and of itself was interesting to me. And so I headed out one chilly morning on a day that promised to be hot with a little bit of a breeze, which is a rare treat around here. Now, I don't think I saw a single other vehicle on the drive to the ghost town. Maybe I did and I wasn't paying attention, but I'm usually a pretty attentive person to things like that. Now, I started to revel in the loneliness. Maybe it was silly for me at a then 23-year-old woman to enjoy isolation and being in the middle of nowhere, but hey, my survival instincts had never been very good. Now, eventually I see a pole or two in the distance that signaled the ghost town. I drove off-road and across the sand for as far as I was comfortable with in my old car and then trekked the rest of the way. And the moment I reached the town, I could tell that something just felt wrong. It wasn't just the feeling of wrongness, although that was certainly there, an unpleasant vibe that made me want to just turn tail and run before I'd even begun. But it was what lay around the ruins and foundations of this town that really unsettled me. I'd learned that the town had been abandoned after the gold rush, when there were no more work to be had and the nearby areas had been tapped, so they just sort of upped and let it die. And that sense of death had clearly remained, because scattered around the town were numerous coyote corpses, all in various stages of decay. Now, I could only tell that they were coyotes because the corpse nearest me was, well, fresh. A macabre part of me thought about taking a photograph, but it felt a bit too morbid. I was about to just up and get out of there when something in the center of the main street caught my eye. Someone was lying on the floor, face up, and I had no choice but to approach, and my eyes were darting around in case this was some kind of trap. No, it most definitely wasn't. The guy laying on the desert ground was dead as dead could be. His skin was shriveled to a paper-thin coating, and bones poked through in places where the epidermis had given up the ghost. He had no eyeballs, of course, and empty, abyssal sockets just gazed up at me. The weirdest thing was he dressed in the garb of someone from at least 20 years ago, and this didn't look like some homeless person had just dropped dead here yesterday. It looked like this man had been dead for a couple of decades, and yet he lay almost on top of the sand, barely covered, as if he'd been exhumed for some purpose. Now, I studied a forensic pathology module at college just before dropping out, so I had a little insight into what I was looking at, and I couldn't see any obvious wounds or causes of death. It was almost like he just laid down and died. and instead of the sand covering his body over the subsequent 20 years, just like the coyotes, he was somehow left visible. I headed off quickly and drove straight home, where I called the cops, and they promised to call me back, and a few days later they did. They said that their pathologist agreed with me that he just laid down and died. There was no sign of some heart attack or anything like that. It was almost like his body had just sort of stopped. Now, this can happen sometimes when someone gets really old or really sick, and when I asked if this guy had been sick, I was told that the pathologist hadn't been able to comment on that, as she hadn't found any evidence of anything directly fatal. No hits to the head, no broken bones of any sort. It was all just very strange. I asked about the coyotes, and they said that this was the jurisdiction of the wildlife department, who hadn't told them anything, so that was just another mystery that I never got solved. I kind of wish that no matter how grim it would have been, I had taken photographs of everything after, but it just felt so disrespectful. I really do think that someone just dug that body up and moved it from some graveyard far away. Now, around a decade later, I was driving down the same road for a much lengthier, days-long road trip, and I saw the location where the town had been and the way the wood had rotted even further. I thought about stopping and going over to take another look, but something stopped me. A kind of darkness that gripped my heart, a voice in my head that said no. And I've long since learned that when my instincts tell me not to do something, I should listen. So as far as I know, that town's still out there, and who knows what might find you if you went there today. I know that I, for one, do not want to find out. Imagine, if you will, a quiet country town. During its heyday, from the swinging 60s to the synth-laden 80s, the population fluctuated around the 1,000 mark. That was the population of this specific town in 1980, and by 1990, just a decade later, the population had dropped to just 63 souls living in the, some would say, cursed town of Centralia. Centralia is perhaps the most famous ghost town of our time, although strictly speaking, it's not entirely a ghost town yet. As of now, 5 residents still remain in the town that never stops burning. The reason for Centralia, Pennsylvania's abrupt abandoning is the stuff of nightmares, but the timeline of events is what makes it especially scary. Nobody can agree exactly on what caused the underground fire that caused the anthracite coal beneath the town to begin burning. Some say it was the regular burning of the town dump. Others claim the fire had started the day before, caused by the dumping of hot coal or ash. Some people believe that the fire had actually been burning since 1932, slowly reaching the mines under the town in the 1960s. The local residents knew vaguely that there was a small fire problem with the disused mining tunnels beneath the town, but it wasn't until 1979, 17 years later, that the townsfolk started to discover the severity of the issue. Now imagine this. You've been living above a slow-burning, potentially lethal fire for 17 years. Essentially, you've been living above hell. And in 1981, the first near tragedy hit the town. A 12-year-old kid named Todd fell into a sinkhole, a mere 4 feet wide but 150 feet deep. The hole suddenly opened beneath his feet in his grandmother's backyard. Due to the blast of the heat and sudden disappearance of the ground, the boy must have felt like he was about to be dragged down to Hades itself. Thankfully, Todd managed to grab hold of a tree root, and his cousin had the chance to play the hero by dragging him to safety. The steam from the sinkhole was tested and found to contain lethal levels of carbon monoxide. Even after Todd's near tragedy, townsfolk were divided on how serious the issue actually was. Evidence of the fire under the town grew and grew, as did the bitter resentment and arguing between those who wanted to up sticks and leave and those who weren't prepared to give up their home. But the government put $42 million in the relocation efforts, and eventually nearly all the residents decided having a very real representation of hell beneath their feet wasn't worth the nostalgia. And by 1990, just 63 people remained. By 2010, only 5 homes were left in Centralia. Hundreds of buildings had been demolished and eminent domain had been invoked on all property in the borough. Now, the fire also spread to a nearby town, ironically named Burnsville, which as of today had been completely evacuated. That one's a true ghost town, if it can even be considered to exist at all anymore. Centralia is still burning. It'll burn underground for another 250 years. Whether humanity will take it upon themselves to rebuild the town for tourism or nostalgia or just a testament to the human spirit, I guess we'll never know in our lifetimes. But for now, based on the last census in 2020, 5 people remain in Centralia, and only one of them is under 18. The place is safe to visit. Apparently there's not much to actually see other than the aftermath of a disaster that's persisted for over 60 years. That and the plumes of smoke that billow up around one of the town's cemeteries, and the ash that dances on in the air. Centralia's not quite a ghost town, not yet, but it certainly feels haunted. And I look and beheld a pale horse, and his name who sat upon him was Death, and hell followed with him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, mi bamboo. I started a new high school in junior year. I was an army brat and I moved around a lot. Unlike a lot of kids who had this kind of upbringing, I'm going to break the mold. I loved it. Spend a year or so hanging out with people, make friends who I could keep in touch with, and then move on to something new and exciting. Genuinely wouldn't have changed my child and teenagehood for anything. My new school was no different. I won't name the school or the state or anything like that, even though it was about 2016. Just cautious, I guess. Some of your viewers seem like they're pretty weird folks, not trying to be rude, but I hang out in those live streams sometimes. I'm just kidding. I love all of you. Now anyway, I'm the kind of sad bastard who's into English and writing and aspires to be a journalist or maybe even a novelist. I know, but hey, I have a finished novel. Nowhere close to publishable quality and a work in progress, so at least I'm doing something with my life. But back then, I spent a lot of time writing in the library. Not ashamed to admit that I wrote a bunch of smutty fanfic. Now this isn't relevant to the story, I promise you. You're just not going to have to read about Markiplier having an affair with Justin McElroy, and yes, I did write one about that. The point is, I'd often get engrossed in my dumb smut writing and wouldn't really notice who was around me. And that's why I'm not sure exactly when Andrew started hanging out in the library, sitting a few tables away from me, pretending to read a middle-grade book, but clearly watching me. Now let me tell you about Andrew. Andrew was sort of special needs. He was autistic to some degree on the spectrum anyway, and he was kind of mathematical and actually a science whiz. Academically very smart, but he liked reading middle-grade books, and he could not, for the life of him, communicate with his peers very properly. Now, it didn't help that he was hard of hearing, and so he sort of talked with this sort of awkward voice that unfortunately made him sound special. And there were a couple of ASL students of the school, and apparently he could hold the deepest, most intellectual conversations via ASL on the extremely rare time that he could bring himself to engage with someone else. Now, Andrew had taken to watching me. I saw him all over the place. Pretty much everyone I spoke to admitted that this was pretty odd, so don't get me wrong. You'd assume Andrew would be the prime target for bullying, right? Well, wrong. If one of the jocks saw a guy so much as give Andrew a hard time, that guy would regret it. Everyone loved him. He may have been almost incommunicado, but he was sort of like, I don't know, everyone wanted to look out for the kid. And I mean everyone. And so I was careful who I mentioned Andrew's stalking to. I had a handful of friends that I'd made there, and I did bring it up to them. And at first they sort of said, you have to be mistaken. Andrew isn't like that. He's a gentle giant. Now I should mention he was nearly 7 feet tall. I'm not kidding. But then I pointed him out, and the way he'd watch me from corners or just openly, and they couldn't deny it. Andrew was, for want of a better word, stalking me. And the first afternoon he followed me home, I knew that I had to do something. But what? I didn't want to turn people on this otherwise harmless special needs student, and all he was really doing is watching me. It wasn't like with lust. You know how you can just tell when someone's lusting after you? It wasn't like that. It was like he was sort of fascinated with me, or that's what it seemed like at first. Maybe this will seem stupid, but I decided to do a bit of stalking my own. I stalked Andrew stalking me, stalkception, and I watched him watching me, and I kept a note of his behavior. One of my friends helped me too, and we came to an extremely odd conclusion. He wasn't stalking me or watching me. He was making sure that he stayed near me. In some ways, this made me feel a little bit better, but it also made me feel more confused. I could not for the life of me work out what his motive was, and I was beginning to feel more and more alone. And then things started getting creepy. I started spotting movement in my yard late at night. My parents both worked for the military, and while we didn't live on base, they often worked late. And my brother was a little 12-year-old brat who was more of an expert at video games than possibly protecting me, though I love my brother, so he really in that moment wasn't going to be much use. But there was someone clearly lurking out there, and the motion detector light would constantly get triggered. Then I found the scraping on my car that looked like someone had tried to break the lock open late at night. Next, there was a note slipped into my locker. I don't want to recount exactly what it said, but it described what someone wanted to do to me. And let's just say it was more Patrick Bateman than Patrick Swayze. It was written in beautiful, exquisite cursive, and this confused me even more. Andrew might have been a savant at many subjects, but penmanship was not one of them. I'd seen his essay work. The handwriting was like a middle schooler. Surely he hadn't somehow persuaded another person to write this disgusting note to me. And meanwhile, he just kept watching me, and he was always just sort of there. And then one day, he wasn't. And I found out through the grapevine that Andrew had an appointment of some kind of neurological clinic and would be gone for a few days. And of course, in that moment, I felt some relief. Well, the fool I was. That evening, I found another note in my locker, even worse than the first, and it actually had blood smeared on it. That night, I was alone overnight. It was a Friday. Someone was in my yard, and they were making a racket, and I could see this black-clad figure, definitely not Andrew, pulling up plants and weirdly spraying the hose around. Obviously, I called the cops. I even yelled out the window that I called the cops, and the guy didn't leave until almost an hour later when the sound of sirens actually blared off in the distance. Now, I was more confused than ever. There was no doubt that Andrew was stalking me, but then so was someone else. Were they in on it together? It all just seemed so unlikely. And it all came to a head when I was walking home one day. It was sunny, a warm day, so I decided to skip the bus. Who followed behind me, ducking behind walls and hedges? Andrew. Now this wasn't normal, and I was sick of it, and I had to say something, so obviously I turned to confront him. And that's when Andrew charged. Almost 7 feet of muscle barreling towards me from a few hundred feet away, and I was frozen on the spot. And then Andrew veered to the right, and with a scream, he dived into an overgrown hedge on the verge of the park that we were walking past. Out he came, flying with that black-clad figure in his grasp. Andrew slammed this person down and began shaking him back and forward, bouncing his head off the grass, and he was shouting something, but it was hard to tell what in the chaos. I ran forward. I had no idea whose side I was supposed to be on in that moment, and then the black-clad figure's hood fell away, and we made eye contact. He immediately let loose this tirade of disgusting slurs aimed at me, and he seemed under the impression that I duped or hired Andrew into protecting me from him. I had no idea who he was at first, and then one of my friends came running up and yelled, "The janitor?" And the conclusion is absolutely insane. Andrew, and only Andrew, had been observant enough to notice that the janitor was paying unusual attention to me, and from what we could get out of him, he felt a sort of dark aura from it all, and he said that a voice in his head told him to protect me. And so why was that janitor behaving like this to me? So my dad's job in the military is specifically military police. The janitor had been a private about 15 years back, and Dad had been the one responsible for catching him in the middle of assaulting a female officer, and he ensured that he spent time in military jail and was dishonorably discharged. So, when we moved that time, the janitor recognized my dad around town, researched him, discovered he'd had kids, and discovered that I went to the high school that he worked at, and decided to terrorize me. I don't know what kind of voice Andrew heard to protect me. I don't know if I believe in that type of thing, but I do know that I think it saved my life. Maybe he didn't go about it in the best way, but he went about it the only way that he really knew how. And it later turned out that the janitor had even been threatening him, promised to hurt him if he didn't stop watching me, and even that didn't put Andrew off. I did my best to befriend him after that. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy that you could become best of friends with, but I think he knew how grateful I was for what he had done, and I didn't stay at that school for much longer, as Dad's job supposedly called him away, but I think he requested a transfer at that point. I still stay in touch with Andrew via email. We sometimes play chess online, and he kicks my butt every time. We don't really have conversations as such, and it's a weird, strange relationship, really, but he's the guy who saved my life from a pretty dangerous stalker, I think, who, for all I know, would have taken things as far as killing me. So frankly, I'm happy to lose as many chess games to Andrew as he wants. I'm a high school teacher, world history, and I have been for coming up on 25 years now. I sport a buzz cut, I rock a cardigan, and I'm kinda squishy around the middle. And while my wife says it makes me lovable, I make sure that I'm hardly much to look at when it comes to younger people I work with. Now, I don't say the following to brag, though, not at all. If anything, it was a curse, and it was a choice to let myself go. And when I just started out as a teacher in my mid-20s, I was, according to my girlfriend at the time, Hollywood attractive. My wife, who I didn't know at the time, look at old photos of me and say that I look like that Glenn Powell fellow everyone loves these days. Now, I guess I knew I was good looking back in those days. I had flings with more than one of my female coworkers, all single, I'll let you know. And when I wasn't sleeping with a young art teacher or the drama one, I'd prowl the bars for one-night hookups, and you could say that I was a bit of a male slut, I guess. I admit all of this because I want you to know that I want to stress as hard as I can that as soon as I entered the classroom, I became a different person. I wanted to be approachable to the students, sure, but my mentor drummed it into me from day one that I could not become their friend, that I had to inspire them, but I could not take them under my wing, and this was in the very early 2000s too, so imagine how much worse it is now. I knew he wasn't screwing with me. Another teacher at the school I started at had left under a cloud. Supposedly he was having an affair with a male student, and he vehemently denied it. Who knew the truth? But I swore to myself that I would never even wind up in a position where I could be under that suspicion. I liked my women mature enough to hold a conversation with me, to be on my level, and most important, goddamn legal. And the idea of being involved with a student sickens me, and I have nothing but contempt for the men and women who go down that path. If it feels like I'm fixating on it, there's a reason. Obviously, despite my best efforts, I found myself in a situation that became a living hell. I'll call her Billy, although that wasn't her real name. She was a senior, had just turned 18, and she really had everything. Head cheerleader, on track to be the prom queen, and a very solid GPA, and there was no reason for her to want more from academia than she did. Except for some reason, she wanted me. Now, when you're a teacher, at least a good one, you can just tell when a student has a crush on you. It's usually harmless. The odd comment, a little lingering after class, and it's easy to put the kibosh on that. But with Billy, it was different. She had a plan, and it started off with very honest-seeming questions about her world history assignments. She'd hang around after class, something I was pretty strict about when it came to having students alone in the classroom, and at first I thought she didn't realize, but it soon became clear that she was intentionally waiting for the classroom to clear before coming to me with questions. Questions I realized that she did not need to ask, being the smart girl that she was. And very quickly, I had to set some firm boundaries. I spoke to some other members of staff and shared my concerns, and they agreed that I was right to be worried. A couple of them had their own experiences with Billy, nothing too serious but enough to make them uncomfortable. At the same time, I didn't want to make myself unavailable to students, and so I came up with a structure where my classroom door had to be open up at all times, and my buddy Chris, the English teacher, would conveniently drop by after Billy's world history class when his AP English class also got out. Billy soon stopped trying to get me alone when it became apparent that Chris was here to stay and we were maybe on to her. Now one day, a new member of the admin staff, who wasn't aware of the whole saga, told me that there was a student outside the teacher's lounge asking about me. Now, cup of coffee in hand, I went to see who it was. It had been a month or so since I'd really heard from Billy, so I was a bit surprised to see her standing there. Now, I was even more surprised at the somewhat revealing outfit that she was wearing. Now, I was certain that that did not meet our dress code, but I didn't want to get into all that with her, so I just asked her what was up. Billy told me she was having some trouble with class, despite her grades very much saying the opposite, and asked if she could book some private tutor sessions with me to raise her grade. Of course, I said no, maybe a little too quickly. I felt a pang of guilt and then tried to soften my words a little. I didn't have the time for private lessons. If I offered them to her, then I'd have to offer them to my entire senior class. It just wasn't possible. I did, however, offer her the number of a private tutor who she could hire for further studies, a septuagenarian lady who'd been my world history teacher and tutored occasionally as part of her retirement. And surprisingly, Billy never called the number. I guess the business card caused Billy to sort of snap because that's when I started finding the typed notes tucked under my windshield. They were typed on those old digital word processors that were popular in the 80s, the follow-up from typewriters, and exactly the kind of technology that a rich family such as Billy's might actually own. Now, this didn't prove anything, of course, but the increasingly weird love letter content did, and I openly ignored them entirely but made sure to file everyone with the principal. And by now, the entire staff was sure that Billy was the culprit, but A, we had no evidence, and B, we didn't want to accuse an innocent girl, and C, Billy's father was somewhat of a pillar of the community, working in construction building of affordable housing, and also something of a large donor to the school. And they were a decent family, honestly, generous, charitable, and beloved. And if there was some way to handle the Billy situation without ruining her reputation, either at school or with her parents, we wanted to take it. It became harder, though, when those love letters started to become threats. What had started as descriptions of things this person wanted to do to me in a very intimate way shifted into a much more sadist method. It got to the point where myself and the principal were a few notes away from actually going to the cops. What if it wasn't Billy after all? What if it was some sick coincidence? Some woman I hadn't called back after what I'd considered an agreed one-night stand, or a husband I hadn't been informed about. And this theory kind of fell by the wayside when I found a pair of crotchless panties tucked into a drawer in my desk. I kept my classroom locked and made sure no students could be in there alone, so how she'd gotten in was a complete mystery. And if it was Billy, she didn't want to make a secret of it. There was a crocheted letter above the lack of crotch, and the first letter of her real name, and while that didn't mean anything, part of me wondered if she somehow knew that she'd gone too far and had to take steps to ensure that I knew that it was her. She knew I wouldn't call the cops on her. Now, handing a pair of crotchless panties over to my middle-aged female principal was one of the most embarrassing moments of my entire life, even if they were in an envelope, but I still had to explain what they were and then stand there as she removed and studied them. She told me that this couldn't escalate, that she was genuinely concerned for me at this point, as I was young and good-looking, and no, the principal was not one of the colleagues that I'd hooked up with, It made me promise that no matter how guilty I might feel, if it came to it, the law needed to get involved. We were nearing the end of the semester, though, and prom and graduation and all of that, and then I'd never have to see her again, and I wondered if maybe these panties were her final hurrah. But how wrong I was. Much like many of the staff, I was a chaperone at the prom. Billy was a shoo-in to be prom queen, along with her prom king boyfriend, Brad, and I kinda hoped that maybe the romantic win up on stage might change things for her, maybe help whatever was going on in her life. And Christ, looking back, I was a dumb 25-year-old and I really did not understand women or anything really, and I don't remember much about the prom. I remember some students getting rowdy and a couple of ejections for drinking on the premises, and weirdly, my biggest memory, save for the incidents, is just how much Billy Idol the DJ played. He was this British guy, and the majority of his repertoire was British music, and I'm not sure how well it landed with the students. But then came the announcement of prom king and queen. Of course, it was Brad and Billy. They took the stage, and Brad gave some gushing speech about how he was with the woman he loved, and he wanted to make her happy for as long as he could, and she'd always be his queen. And then Billy spoke. I'll always remember her opening gambit. She turned to Brad, smacked the crown off his head, and said, "You sicken me." And then she launched into a tirade about how he was a boy playing a man, and how he constantly wanted intimacy, and she said some extremely crude things that did not paint Brad in a good light. And my heart broke for her. But then she turned to me, and told me that I was the one that she was destined to be with, that I was a real man, and we were soulmates, and we were destined to be together. Some absolute joker manning the lights put a spotlight on me, and there was just complete, awkward silence. What could I do? I had no choice but to tell Billy that there was no chance, that she was a child and I was an adult. And I tried to be as kind as possible. I told her that she'd find someone, but it couldn't be me. And I told her that I did not find her attractive, that she was nothing but just some kid to me. I really didn't notice how much it actually broke her. I was staring at my shoes, worried that I couldn't finish my speech if I looked up at her, and I didn't see the tears pouring down her face and all that mascara. But I did hear the slow clapping and then the laughter and erupting from the entire dance hall, all aimed at Billy, the most embarrassing, mortifying moment of her life, and I'd been the cause of it. But I didn't have time to feel guilty. I saw some movement and I saw Billy leaping down off of the stage. I saw her grab the sharp, lengthy knife that was resting near one of the prom cakes, and I saw her charge straight at me, blade raised, prom dress flying behind her, her face blackened by mascara and tears. And I did the only thing I could think to do as someone that was charging at me with a huge carving knife. I used my years of defensive martial arts training to sidestep her and send her sprawling to the ground. Only she didn't hit the ground. She hit a table behind me on which stood another prom sponge cake, and this one was untouched. The knife flew from her hand and Billy slammed straight into that cake and the table collapsing under her weight. Everyone was silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted with even more laughter. Billy pulled herself to her feet, her prom dress ruined, cake and punch and food all over her, and she turned to me, and she stared at me, and I braced myself for the most terrifying threat of my life, and all Billy said was, "I'm sorry," and then turned around and left the school gym. Now, long story short, Billy quite obviously needed obvious psychiatric help that she'd hidden the need for. She had managed to graduate and with a high GPA, but college wasn't on the cards for her. Following the prom and her year of obsession, she spent 2 entire years in a rehabilitation institute. I expected her parents to blame me, and instead they thanked me for how I handled the situation and kept me up to date with her progress. After a year, I moved schools to a different state, and they would write me occasionally. Eventually, they let me know that Billy had been released and asked if I would be willing to receive a letter from her, and they told me they understood if the answer was no, but I decided to say yes. It was a single sheet containing a single paragraph, and I still have that letter to this day, and I can type it verbatim. It said, "Thank you. Thank you for not taking advantage of me. I'm sorry I pushed you so far, and I'm better now. I'm going to college in the fall, and I'm going to study world history, and I will make you proud, sir. Billy." I don't know what kind of life she's living now. I hope it's her best life, and I hope she recovered from whatever caused her behavior. But I know one thing. As I near retirement, Billy taught me as many lessons as I've taught all my students over the years, and I still refuse to be alone in a classroom with anyone who isn't a colleague. I don't think Alex Crowley was his real name, but that's what he went by, and that's what we called him. I didn't know him at first, not personally anyway. He was a sophomore when I was a freshman. I was a grungy skater kid in the late 90s, into Real Big Fish and Green Day and Sublime and a bit of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. I know, both. And I felt kind of like a badass poser because I was into Failure, a band most of my friends didn't even know, and even more badass, I was an American fan of Jesus and Mary Chain. I'd found Darklands and Automatic in an indie record store, and I'd fallen in love with both LPs. I was a bit of a musical snob is what I mean, despite being a 90s skater kid who could do a bit of grinding and a few ollies and landed a 180 spin about once, but mostly just made bailing videos with my buddy. We were the skaters, the losers, the punks, and we loved it. And our heroes, our absolute idols in high school, were the trench coat goths in the year above us. Their leader was a fellow called Alex Crowley, and he claimed to be a direct descendant of famed occultist, mountaineer, ceremonial magician, and founder of the religion of Thelema, Aleister Crowley. But of course he couldn't prove that because Aleister Crowley had so many illegitimate descendants that if you were one of them, you just knew. I suppose maybe that was true, but I'm pretty sure neither of Alex's parents were secret descendants of Aleister Crowley either. And I'm pretty sure the guy ate poop too, so I'm not sure that I'd brag about being related to him personally. Now, I remember when Alex and his crew first approached us as we were sort of skating around. They just stood there in their trench coats, staring and scowling, and there were 4 of them. Alex, Ashley, Jack, and Felicity, the only girl in the group who I had the biggest, maddest crush on and who drove me absolutely wild in her low-cut corsets and goth makeup. Now, she was actually nice too, unlike the others. Jack in particular was a thug, and I'm pretty sure he liked to hurt animals, but I won't dwell on that too much. Alex and Flick are the key players here that you'll have to remember, as well as me, Frankie, and my twin sister Kimmy, who were part of the skate crew. Now, this is how things would play out for about a week. Our group would just nonchalantly skate around on the steps outside the high school, and Alex's group, who I later found out he nicknamed the Sons of Joseph, would just stand there watching us, kind of sneering. And then one weekend we were hanging out at the skate park when we saw the Sons of Joseph come stalking in. One of the skaters yelled insults and derogatory terms at them, and they weren't exactly seen as the cool people by the older guys. But Alex and co gave us as good as they got, and we were enamored. I was even more enamored when I saw Flick walk over to us. Was she going to speak to me? Oh my god. Well, no. Actually, she spoke to Kimmy and told her that she was a whiz on the skateboard. And later that night, I told Kimmy how jealous I was, and she would not let me live it down. However, being a good sister, she told me that Flick had invited her to the mall tomorrow and maybe I could tag along. Hell yes, of course I would. And so Kimmy and I got there, and we didn't tell the other guys, and I was a little disappointed to discover that Alex, Jack, and Ashley were there too. Well, I didn't have to worry about Jack for long. He got into a fight with a security guard and he got thrown out of the mall, and Alex said that he was done with that prick. He was a liability and he didn't understand the ways, and maybe Kimmy and I would like to take Jack's place in the Sons of Joseph. Now, one look from Flick's bright, mascaraed eyes, and I was nodding like some puppy dog. Kimmy was a little bit more sensible and asked what the Sons of Joseph actually meant. I remember Alex tapping his nose and said that was something we'd discover in time. Sure, whatever, Kimmy said. And Alex replied saying that he'd hoped we'd brought money because we'd need whole new wardrobes to join their crew. I'm not ashamed to say that Kimmy and I came from a pretty wealthy family, and Kimmy was trusted with Dad's credit card. Not me, though. He knew that I'd wasted on probably video games, and she was pretty certain that spending the money on clothes would please our parents, so Alex, Ashley, and Flick led us to a hot topic. My outfit was a trench coat, a Misfits t-shirt, and a pair of leather pants that squeaked when I walked. Now, I wasn't so sure about this, but Alex promised me the squeaking would eventually wear off, and I thought about buying some cool boots, but they convinced me that my purple and black skater DCs looked kinda dope with the goth outfit. Kimmy, meanwhile, got dressed out by Flick, and I gotta say, it was extremely disconcerting to see my sister in fishnets, a miniskirt, and a mesh top with her bra visible beneath. In fact, I actually tried to persuade her that our parents really wouldn't approve of that. And she kinda listened and bought a second outfit that was more like a velour dress and made her look like a vampire, and I suppose that was pretty cool. Now, I could tell that Alex had eyes for Kimmy, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I wasn't sure how I felt about him at all, now that I'd spent an afternoon with him. He talked and talked and talked, and he talked about his connection to Aleister Crowley and thalamic magic and crap like that. Ashley brought up the Satanic Bible, and Alex laughed. I kid you not, for 5 minutes straight in the food court of KFC before declaring that Anton LaVey was a fraud who wouldn't know true Satanism if it bit him in the ass. I figured now wasn't the best time to tell them that Kimmy and I were Christians, so we just nodded along. I did do some reading about thalamic lore and the Order of Thelema and things like that over the next few months because I'm nothing if not academically curious. It amused me to discover that Alex was basically just making up crap. None of the garbage he spewed was accurate at all, and even though by then I'd already realized that he was a complete charlatan, it was nice to have something to laugh with Kimmy about. Speaking of Kimmy, Alex was constantly, relentlessly trying to get into her pants. Kimmy could hold her own and had obviously no interest in letting Alex take her virginity, but it still made me defensive. He was a creep and a weirdo, and not only that, he was always claiming to hear voices from his true father. He could never decide whether his true father was Aleister Crowley or Satan himself, and in his head I think that they were sort of interchangeable. One of the messages he mysteriously received was that Kimmy should engage in thalamic intimate magic with him, and when she flat out refused, he said that dancing naked for him with sigils drawn on her body would be enough. Kimmy stopped hanging out with him after that. Too exhausting, she said, and she begged me to ditch them too, but at this point, I'd kind of abandoned all my other friends. But to make matters worse, I was deeply, hopelessly head over heels in love with Flick, and it wasn't unrequited either. We were a couple, but we had to keep it a secret from Alex because according to him, the sons of Joseph, male or female, must only lay with him and nobody else. Ashley had ditched the group by this time too and started hanging out with the chess club. We had a new member, and by the name of Norbit, I'm being serious, a nerdy kid whose presence I couldn't even begin to explain. And so the only way for me and Flick to be together was to pretend to tolerate Alex. Any attempt that we made to ditch him resulted in him mysteriously appearing or showing up at my house, which was even worse because I didn't want him anywhere near my sister. Things would have been fine, I think, if Alex hadn't suddenly had an influx of hormones and decided that his true father was sending him messages that we all needed to obey. Suddenly, Norbert's presence made sense. He was a member of the AV club, and Alex's dark father had instructed him to rig a video camera hidden in the vents in the female changing rooms so we could corrupt the fairer sex in the name of Satan without them even knowing. Of course, Flick and I were horrified by this, and Kimmy wanted to kill Alex as soon as I told her, but simply talking about something wasn't a crime. We needed proof that he was actually planning on doing it. He gave Norbit a list of times for the recordings. I stole a copy, and surprise, surprise, they were all times when Kimmy would be coming out of the gym or out of the pool, and this creep was basically planning to stalk my sister by filming her naked. I took Norbit to one side and Flick, and I told him in no uncertain terms that if he went ahead with his plan, we would not only ruin him and his entire high school career, but there was a good chance we'd end his life too. This dumb freshman, I was a sophomore at this point, Flick was a junior, fell for it, and I guess took it so seriously that he changed schools within the month. When it became clear to Alex that his plan to film the girls' locker room had failed, he flew into a rage. He slammed me up against the wall of the AV room, which we now had the keys to thanks to Norbert, and told me that this wasn't going to happen, and that I was going to have to be the one to film Kimmy. I'd be able to do it at home easily, and his true father, the Dark Lord, would bestow upon me untold riches. I told him where he could shove his untold riches, and if he came anywhere near us again, he'd wish he'd never been born. Finally, myself, Kimmy, and Flick were free. Flick and I were able to date openly now, and Kimmy didn't have to worry about this creep trying to, well, creep on her. Or so we thought. As one night Kimmy, Flick, and I were hanging out in Kimmy's bedroom playing 3-player GoldenEye deathmatch, and suddenly, a red light kept glaring on the screen. Initially, Kimmy jokingly blamed one of us, saying that we were trying to put her off with a laser pointer. But then the red light quickly disappeared, and we heard some scuffling and banging outside. I ran to the window to see this trench coat figure fleeing into the night. It was obviously Alex. He'd been testing to see if he could film Kimmy himself through her bedroom window. Flick had the dumbest yet funniest idea. Using our brand new color printer, we printed out a huge image of a fat man's ass and taped it on the window, and then we waited for Alex to come back that night, which we knew he would, and we heard him out there. He was hardly subtle. Kimmy yelled that she was going to take a shower, and we gave it 10 minutes, and then we pulled the blinds open, revealing the large printout of that ass. And I guess Alex had been filming because we heard this sort of strangled shriek and then the clattering of something falling to the floor, and saw that a trench-coated figure was running away again. When we went out there, the school's camcorder lay abandoned in the flower bed. We watched through the tape. It turned out he'd filmed Kimmy more than he thought. We were all watching when she snatched the videotape away from us and watched the next few minutes alone, and her face went pale. "Just underwear," she said. "But I feel sick." Kimmy didn't tell us anything else. Neither of us asked either. But a few days later, Alex was found with both of his legs broken, apparently by a baseball bat, and he claimed that he'd been jumped by a gang of black guys. When we asked Kimmy if she had planned to pursue the video any further, she just said no. I don't want to say that my sister kneecapped a goth stalker while in high school, but let's just say, years later, and even though you passed away 6 years ago, I'll always be proud of you, Kimmy. My high school years took place in the mid-2000s. I'm a female, and for most of my high school career, probably until senior year, my entire friend group was made up of girls and one single guy, called Guy, who was probably the gayest fellow you could ever meet. We all had this weird thing where we decided that none of us were going to date during high school, and this completely went out of the way during senior year when, I guess, hormones just became too much, but as far as I know, most of us stuck to it. Sure, we snuck a kiss at a party here and there, and I'm not saying that we were prude little good girls, but we had this pact with each other that we were just going to focus on our studies. And that's why we were so shocked when one of our girlies, perhaps the most straight-laced, accidentally let slip that she had a mother-effing sugar daddy. We grilled our friend Samantha within an inch of her life. What had he bought you? Shoes, clothes, jewelry? She had it all to display. Was she physical with him? Of course, very much so. She was sorry that she'd broken the pact, but Mr. X might be the one, and she didn't want to let that slip through her fingers, not when he was so much older than her. Of course, that was scandalous by itself and led to another round of questioning. How old was he? Mid-40s? Was he married? And Samantha shyly admitted that yes, he was. Married with kids. Did we know this guy? Samantha said no, but her hesitation in her eyes, they said yes. It was a man in his 40s with kids that we knew. Now, we pretended to let it drop. We lied and said we were happy for her. Of course, we were all pretty disgusted that our 16-year-old friend was being taken advantage of by a 45-year-old man who was clearly lying about leaving his wife for her and keeping her sweet by giving her some fairly gaudy stuff. I don't know much about sugar daddies, but honestly, I would have expected a little more from the gifts. She said he took her out to dinner too and stayed in some nice hotels, but still. So we pretended to drop it, and instead, we all secretly spied on Samantha individually. I know it sounds awful, but I'll stand by it. We didn't want our friend being seduced by some dirty old man. And there was one guy whose name kept coming up, Mr. Kurswell, one of the science teachers. Samantha would often meet with him after class, and while we couldn't spy for too long, it was absolutely the only lead we had. So Mr. Kurswell became our target, and there was definitely something off about him. He'd sneak phone calls into hidden corners during lunch break. If he was using his laptop when class started, he'd often slam it closed and make sure that we weren't looking before he opened it again. There was something very off about this guy, and we became more and more convinced that this balding, bespectacled biology teacher was the one boinking our buddy. But the question was, what next? That's when Guy had this bright idea of trying to follow Mr. Kurswell one weekend. We had no idea where he'd go or when he'd go, but we decided to time it for a Saturday where Samantha had also refrained from hanging out and heavily claimed that she had a hot date with her mystery sugar daddy. If it was Kurswell, then boom, we were in luck. If not, maybe we'd catch sight of the real culprit. And so we all loaded into Guy's car, and apparently, as subtle as a cop tailing a suspect, we followed Samantha for nearly an hour and found ourselves in the next town over. It was one of those little towns that you kind of look down on. Jokes about the folks there being inbred and the fact that there was a weird smell. A cellophane factory explained that, and just kind of overall crappy. Not exactly the place that you'd expect a hot date with a sugar daddy. Samantha headed into this crappy mall, and we followed at a pretty long distance, and it became clear pretty quickly that she was checking out some stores. There were 4 of us without Samantha, so we decided that it didn't make sense for the entire group to tail her. We'd be spotted in an instant. And she was headed mostly into these girly stores, so despite her penchant for glitter and pink, we figured Guy should hang back. It was decided that I was the most nondescript and unnoticeable. Not sure if that was a compliment, but it worked well enough here. And so I followed Samantha into a bunch of stores, and what I saw shocked me. The gifts her sugar daddy had been bestowing on her, she was shoplifting them. I followed her into 4 stores and watched as she stole costume jewelry, lingerie, a crop top, and all sorts of crap. Not once did she get spotted by security either. I hightailed it out of there. I didn't want to get wrapped up in all of that, and I didn't want to look complicit. And so I met my friends at the agreed point, a sort of hidden area where we weren't in much danger of being spotted by Samantha. I was all ready to hit them with my revelation, but I didn't have a chance. They were the ones who hit me with the gossip. We were right. Our science teacher, Mr. Kurswell, was here in the same mall as Samantha, and what more proof did we need? I waited until they finished chattering and then told them what I'd observed. There was no sugar daddy offering gifts. Samantha was a kleptomaniac. Presumably she'd traveled to the next town over because the local mall security were getting suspicious in our town. And so everyone was absolutely baffled. They definitely seen Kurswell, and he definitely seemed sketchy. And at the same mall as Samantha, too. Could it be possible that they were having a fling, but the gifts were stolen for our benefit to try and justify all of it? Or had we been stalking our friend for literally no reason? It didn't make any sense. Why would Kurswell be at this mall? Now, it was over an hour outside of town, and our local mall was 1,000 times better. All we could do was head out and plan to head home, but first we decided to stop by the food court to grab some macas. And that's when we saw him. Mr. Kurswell sat at a goddamn McDonald's 2-seater holding hands with someone who was not his wife. And it wasn't Samantha, though, either. Mr. Kurswell and the man whose hand he held both turned to us. The unknown man looked puzzled. Mr. Kurswell looked sick. He stood up and immediately began pleading for us to come over. Now, let's get this straight. If we hadn't suspected Kurswell of being Samantha's sugar daddy, we would have gone on liking the dude. He was one of our favorite teachers, in fact. And now, he looked close to tears. The idea of him having an affair, even if it was to hide the truth of his identity, kind of made me feel sick, and the first thing I thought was, his poor wife. But then he called it over and explained everything. His wife knew. She too was of the same kind of proclivities as he was. She'd also always wanted kids, which were indeed his, and they both loved their kids very much. And they loved each other too, but in their own little way. But this whole business had begun years ago, before homosexuality was quite so acceptable, and the whole deal that they had with the kids and an unusual marriage, it had been a long-term lie that they just didn't want to have to explain to friends and family. He said that we could call his wife if we wanted. He said that he knew we were good kids, and he said that he was sure that some of us understood, looking pointedly at Guy at this point. And that's how the stalking of our best friend and our science teacher led us to helping him and his wife cover up their conventional marriage. We provided alibis and we did all sorts of things. And we also kind of cut Samantha off after we tried our best to talk her out of being a klepto. She refused and also saw no problem with the sugar daddy lie. We didn't tell her anything about Kurtzwell, but we did tell her that we'd had a suspect and she didn't seem to care about their well-being. It just made us realize that people are never who they seem to be or who you expect them to be. And as a funny aside, Guy, who is the campiest, gayest man I've ever met, eventually realized that he was just as into women as he was into men, and now he's one of the biggest players, in a nice way, that I've ever met. Mr. Kurtzwell still lives with his wife, and their kids have gone off to college now, and they're considering finally living their true lives. The kids know the truth and have done so for many years, but ultimately, it's whatever makes them happy. All I'm glad is that our one little jaunt into stalking didn't lead to the ruination of multiple lives. But I'll tell you what, from now on, I've decided that unless it seems like someone's in danger, nothing is my business to get involved in. It was my idea to put on a horror production. We were the alternative theater kids. We begged the drama teacher to let a bunch of us do our own thing, and instead of yet another performance of West Side Story or Grease, all our bitching worked, and eventually Mrs. J relented. Now, my friend Kirsten wrote the script. It was a slasher play rife with squibs and blood and fake ghosts, and low on plot, really. Nobody was going to attend expecting to see Waiting for Godot, though. They wanted blood, guts, and one shocking scene, boobs. Now don't worry, we used prosthetics. None of us were getting our boobs out for a goddamn school play. Plus, we didn't want to get expelled, obviously. We practiced that play for God knows how many times, and at that stage we knew it off by heart. But something we'd never done is perform it at night. And that's when it would be debuting as a horror play, so, of course, we begged and pleaded with Mrs. J to let us start one final rehearsal at 8 p.m. It took some cajoling, but she relented. The grumpy, scary janitor even agreed to stay late to keep an eye on us so we didn't break his crap. Now, we were all excited. There were 8 of us in total, 6 players, the director, myself, and the lighting and sound guy. I won't list all 8 names because you'll forget them all. But the 4 important ones are me, Ayla, Victor as an actor, Judd as an actor who plays the killer, and Clyde as an actor, the tragic hero. And so we ran through the first scene where a few of the characters are playing spin the bottle in a cabin in the woods. The bottle stops 5 times, creating the shape of a pentagram, and a visual effect causes a mysterious puff of smoke to leave the bottle. Dead impressive. Of course, all the characters decide that it's the ghosts of Rancid Jack, a serial killer who stalked those woods 100 years ago. And of course it is. So the rest of the play continues with the characters getting picked off by Rancid Jack one by one, until only Vicky, the virgin final girl, and Clyde, the boyfriend, are left. After we ran through the first scene, 2 of the actors went outside for a smoke break, and they never returned. It didn't matter too much, we just decided to mess around tweaking some of the practical effects. The sound guy did a bunch of improvements too, and I really think we had something special on our hands. To this day, I swear that if we'd actually got to perform this damn play, it would have gone down in our high school history, and not just because of the prosthetic bloody boobs. Now, eventually, we needed our 2 missing actors, so the other actor, Layla, went to look for them. She didn't return either, but we did hear a scream. This caused Judd and Clyde to go running out into the barely lit corridor. Me and Vicky stayed behind like the nervous girls we were, and of course Denny, the sound guy, had to stay and protect us. Now, this was his excuse anyway. Eventually, Clyde and Judd returned, looking pale and terrified. There'd been no sign of any of the missing 3, except for a bucket load of blood. Some of it was outside and some of it was in the corridor. Now, of course, we all started freaking out. The only person in the building who wasn't accounted for was the freaky janitor, Mr. Williams. All sorts of rumors circulated about this guy. He was an ex-con. He'd spent time inside for killing a man in a bar fight, and he'd fought in Vietnam and had the highest kill count in his unit. He had a tin of Viet Cong teeth in his little basement office. One student swore blind that they'd seen it before Williams had chased him off. Now, there was no doubt in my mind, freaked out by constant horror play rehearsals and the alleged blood, that this janitor had killed our friends. Maybe he'd watched the play and it had triggered the Nam flashbacks. Who knew? Denny and Vicky and Judd volunteered to go get help, which, thinking back now, was kind of an odd group. Why 3 of them? All I knew was that this left me with Clyde, my IRL boyfriend, and I wasn't going to argue against holding up with him. Now, we hid in the sound booth and listened in horror as we heard running footsteps and screams and even pleas for help. All 3 of our friends had met grisly fates, we thought, and that just left us. We had no choice but to try and escape the building and call the cops. Clyde grabbed a heavy metal bar and we made our way into the corridors, and if there had been blood there before, it was gone now. Williams must have cleaned it up, and there was no sign of the bodies either. I was crying, begging Clyde to protect me, begging him not to let me die. And then, up ahead of us, the door to the maintenance area burst open. The janitor stood there, some pole held in his hand, and a look of fury on his face. He yelled, asking what the hell we thought we were doing. Clyde didn't even think to stop. He charged Williams with a metal pipe and cracked him in the skull, and this sent him collapsing to the ground, and then Clyde went to town hammering the guy's legs so he couldn't come after us. And between the grunts, he told me that he didn't want to kill him, that he had to face justice, but he had to make sure the guy never walked again and couldn't come after us. And by the time he was done, Williams' right leg was a bloody pulp, and the left had visible bone fractures in 3 places. Williams was trying to say something. Blood was bubbling out of his mouth, but Clyde kicked him in the side. Then the door burst open, and the rest of the cast yelled, "Surprise!" The cry died on their lips as they saw Williams lying on the floor, Clyde standing over him with a bloody dripping pipe like a madman, and the whole thing had been an idiotic, ill-fated prank. Everyone was in on it except for myself and Clyde, and Mr. Williams apparently. The prank ruined all of our lives. Despite thinking he was protecting his girlfriend from a stalker, Clyde faced charges when Williams, quite understandably, demanded that the full weight of the law come down upon him. And due to the extenuating circumstances, he only spent a couple of years in juvie, but it still ruined his life. The others had to live with the guilt of what they caused. They were all expelled, of course, and more than one of them ended up taking a dark path through life. And from what I know, at least one of them has ended their life over that guilt. As for me, I don't know that I'll ever get over it. Seeing Clyde defend me like that only to mutilate an innocent man, and even then I can't convince myself that there wasn't a serial killer trying to take us all out that night. My head is a mess. I've been in and out of institutes, and my latest therapist recommended that I blog about my teenage drama. I don't know if sending my story into Let's Read is the best, most cathartic idea. I know many of your audience will tell me I'm a terrible person and that we all deserve what we got. Maybe that's what I need to hear. Maybe I need to accept that we all jumped the gun and acted like fucking retards. I know we did. I guess I just need to self-flagellate, and I'm hoping that the Let's Read audience will finally either help me move on or help me blame myself enough to make a final decision. All I want to say is, Mr. Williams, if you happen to hear this from heaven or wherever you are right now, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that, and you weren't a stalker, and I'm sorry my boyfriend crippled you. Hey Dark Somnium. I'm a YouTuber just like you. Not quite as big, sadly. I've only got a few thousand subscribers since 2012, but I'm getting there. I got some plans for the next year that should bring me into the big time. I'd love to pick your brain for some help in getting bigger, actually, and if you got the time one day, email me at drinkthepiss@gmail.com anytime you want to chat, and would be really appreciated. Now, I'm not just emailing you trying to collaborate, though, I promise. I have a quick, scary story that I want to share with you and your lovely audience. Please subscribe to me on my channel, by the way. And so my channel I've kind of hit a brick wall. I hit a few thousand subscribers back in the 2010s when stupid Call of Duty videos and YouTube poops were popular, and I've never really grown since then. People don't care about goofy COD videos anymore, it seems, or baked memes, and it makes me sad. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I was a high schooler when I got big on YouTube. As you know, being an old man veteran, a few thousand subs was a big deal back in 2013, before the likes of my heroes like Leafy and iDubbbz, not to mention the main man Charlie and that Hassan Piker the Twitch streamer. And the way I figure it, when you factor in inflation, 3,000 subs in 2013 is about the same as 10 million now, give or take. And so, when some kids at my school discovered that I was a YouTuber with what they saw was a crazy amount of subs, I became something of a celebrity. They uncovered my double life because I made the mistake of watching my own content on the library computers, and they saw what I was up to. Oh well, I thought. I kind of expected that I'd just become a minor celebrity in sixth form, as I went to one of the UK schools that includes sixth form as part of the school itself, and yeah, I guess that happened. Now what I didn't foresee, though, was Rick. Rick was in the year below me, so AS level, and he was a film studies student. When he discovered I was a successful YouTuber, he went kinda nuts. It took him a few days to gather the courage to approach me, but when he did that day in the cafeteria, there was no stopping him. Rick talked. A lot. He had all these ideas for my YouTube channel. Ideas that even I, as a forward-thinking and imaginative individual, could clearly tell were too ambitious. Now, I was out there making COD fail videos, SpongeBob memes, and Counter-Strike parkour videos while talking about the latest online drama. Rick basically wanted us to make a goddamn feature film. I wouldn't have minded so much about Rick sitting at the cafeteria table with me every free period. Nobody else really did, and they were a bit intimidated by me being a big YouTuber, except for the fact that Rick stunk. And now, excuse my language, but he smelled like Jason Momoa's armpit hair. In the end, my nasal cavities couldn't put up with Rick's stink anymore, so I told him that I just wasn't interested in his stupid video ideas. And I could see the tears welling up in this kid's eyes as I told him the home truths he needed to hear, and I thought that'd be the end of it. But no, I kept finding notes in the common room, the cafeteria, and all of my classrooms pinned to the notice board and the whiteboard. Sometimes they'd just say, "Make videos with me, please, Rick." And other times they'd be an entire page describing some idea about an entire zombie movie that he wanted us to film and release on my YouTube channel. And the more I found the notes, the more Rick kept bragging about how his YouTube channel was growing. So in the end, I looked up the channel name that he'd given me, Ricky Dicky Davy, it's thankfully gone now, and saw that the chode had 8 subscribers. Effing heck, mate. I subscribe anyway, out of pity. Big mistake, I think, and this inspired Rick to start posting. A lot. But he didn't just post the usual YTPs or takedowns of Pokemon or Content Cop or elephants pooping at the zoo. No. Every video he posted was a clip of behind the scenes of a famous YouTuber. He didn't say a famous YouTuber. He said my username, but I don't want to do too much self-promotion here. It was crazy. The dude had been filming me all around college, from a distance, eating alone in a cafe, hanging out on the quad smoking a cigarette, playing squash in the gym, coming out of the changing rooms all sweaty. And I kid you not, he filmed me in the changing rooms, not naked thankfully, but titled, "Famous YouTuber Works Hard for His Fans." Now, I could immediately tell this was stalking, pure and simple. Now, I'd had enough of this Rick guy. I found him spying on me one day and took his digital camera and smashed it to pieces on the ground. I slammed him up against a wall and told him that if he ever filmed me ever again, if I ever saw him on my channel again, I would ruin his life with all of the power of a certain Chan-based message board who I had a good relationship with thanks to my videos. I thought Rick got the message. I got an in-school suspension for fighting, but it was worth it. Rick left the school at the end of the term, but not before telling me he'd get even with me. I thought nothing more of the confused little prick for 3 years. He never uploaded again, and I went off to college and continued my career. Things weren't great. I struggled to make friends and then hit rock bottom when my girlfriend left me, and I'd never know what true suffering was like until then. I became a bit of a shut-in for a while, but eventually got over it and became a party animal, filming it all, of course. And speaking of filming, there was one final twist in the tale. One day, I get an alert on YouTube saying that Ricky Dicky Davy has uploaded, and so I click the video out of morbid curiosity. It's a series of videos, in fact. A series of videos taken on a handheld camera filming a house at night from outside. My house. My shared house at college. Somehow Rick had tracked me down. I watched in horror as he just filmed me through my living room doing my stretches and exercises and playing the PlayStation. And that was all. Just hours and hours of footage of me doing nothing. The video ended with a movie maker text saying, "This is the price of fame." Then Rick walked back towards the camera, showing a steaming turd on my driveway. A turd that I remembered picking up that morning and believing it to belong to the dog next door. Ricky Ticky Davy's channel is now gone. Mine's still up, and again, I'd really appreciate a shout out to the channel if you read the story. But even though I only have a few thousand followers and I've moved twice since the events of this story, I still live in fear that one day, Stinky Rick will find me and make me the subject of his new video, and this time, it'll be a snuff film. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks and bonus content for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Please go subscribe. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, trail mix is human kibble.